On January 21st, 1966, Staff Sergeant Robert Baer squeezed his 6-foot frame into a hole barely 2 feet wide. The entrance to the Viet Cong tunnel had been discovered during a routine patrol near the Cu Chi district, just 30 miles northwest of Saigon. Baer had volunteered for this mission, though he didn't fully understand what he was getting into. Armed with only a flashlight and a .45 caliber pistol, he began his descent into absolute darkness. The entrance dropped almost vertically for about 6 feet, before leveling off into a horizontal passage. Baer had to lower himself down carefully, his boots searching for footholds in the earthen walls. Once he reached the horizontal section, the real challenge began. The tunnel was narrow, impossibly narrow. He had to turn sideways just to fit his shoulders through, then drop to his stomach to continue forward. Within minutes, the tunnel narrowed even further. Baer had to exhale completely just to inch forward on his stomach, pushing the flashlight ahead of him with one hand while dragging his pistol with the other. The air was thick, humid, and stale. Each breath felt like he was inhaling wet cotton. He could feel the earth pressing against him from all sides, could hear his own breathing echoing off the clay walls just inches from his face. The weight of the soil above him, tons and tons of earth, seemed to press down on his back. His flashlight beam cut through the darkness ahead, revealing nothing but more tunnel stretching forward into blackness. The walls were smooth, packed hard by years of foot traffic and careful maintenance. Tree roots hung down from the ceiling in places, and he had to push them aside as he crawled. Some were thick as his wrist, others thin as hair, but all of them were obstacles that snagged on his clothing and equipment. Baer had been crawling for about 15 minutes when his light caught something ahead. Movement. Then a pair of eyes staring back at him from the darkness. Human eyes, reflecting his flashlight beam like an animal's eyes caught in headlights. For a frozen moment, Baer and the unseen Vietnamese soldier stared at each other through the darkness. Then instinct took over. Baer fired instinctively. The muzzle flash temporarily blinded him in the confined space, and the deafening crack of the gunshot in the tunnel left his ears ringing with a high-pitched whine that drowned out all other sound. The smell of cordite filled the narrow passage, but he had missed. The eyes disappeared, and he heard the frantic scrambling of feet moving away from him, deeper into the tunnel system. The Vietnamese soldier was fleeing, getting away, disappearing into passages he knew intimately, while Baer was completely blind and disoriented. Baer wanted to pursue, but his hands were shaking. His heart was pounding so hard he thought it might burst through his chest, and he realized with sudden clarity that he was trapped underground with an enemy who knew these tunnels intimately while he was completely blind and vulnerable. The Vietnamese soldier could be anywhere now, could be waiting around the next bend in the tunnel, could be circling back through a parallel passage, could be preparing an ambush at a junction ahead. For the first time in his military career, Baer felt genuine terror, not the adrenaline-fueled fear of a firefight on the surface where you could see your enemy and had room to maneuver. This was different. This was the primal fear of being trapped underground, in the dark, with a predator that could see better than you, move better than you, and knew the territory better than you. Every advantage belonged to the enemy. Baer made the decision to retreat. Moving backward through a tunnel barely wider than his shoulders was even harder than moving forward. He had to push with his hands and pull with his toes, inching backward, unable to see where he was going. Every few feet he would stop and listen, straining to hear any sound that might indicate the Vietnamese soldier was pursuing him or moving to cut off his escape. It took him nearly 40 minutes to crawl backward to the tunnel entrance. When he finally emerged into the sunlight, gasping and covered in red clay dust, his platoon sergeant took one look at him and knew something had gone badly wrong. Baer was shaking. His eyes were wild, and he couldn't speak coherently for several minutes. He had just experienced his first and last tunnel mission. He would never volunteer to go underground again, but other men would, hundreds of them over the course of the war. They became known as the Tunnel Rats, a small elite group of American and Australian soldiers who volunteered for one of the most psychologically demanding and dangerous jobs of the entire Vietnam War. These men descended into the claustrophobic darkness of the Cu Chi Tunnel Network, a vast underground city built by the Viet Cong that stretched for over 150 miles beneath the Vietnamese countryside. Down there, in passages so narrow that a man could barely turn around, the tunnel rats fought a completely different kind of war. A war of absolute darkness, suffocating spaces, and constant psychological terror. A war where the usual advantages of American military might meant nothing. Where superior firepower, air support, artillery, and technology were useless. Where combat was reduced to its most primitive and personal form. One man, alone in the dark, armed with nothing but a pistol and his courage, crawling through enemy territory where every inch might contain a trap designed to kill him. This was psychological warfare in its purest form. Not propaganda or mind games, but actual warfare that attacked the human psyche as much as the human body. The tunnels were designed to terrify, to break the spirit of anyone who entered them. And yet, the tunnel rats kept going down, mission after mission, day after day, descending into hell, because someone had to do it. The Cu Chi tunnels were not a military innovation created specifically for the Vietnam War. Their origins stretched back decades to the French colonial period, rooted in the Vietnamese resistance movement's long history of guerrilla warfare against foreign occupiers. Understanding the tunnels requires understanding this history, because the tunnels were not just military installations. They were a physical manifestation of Vietnamese determination to resist, to survive, and to outlast any enemy through sheer perseverance. In the late 1940s, as Vietnamese guerrillas fought against French occupation, communist fighters known as the Viet Minh began digging rudimentary tunnels in the Cu Chi district. These early tunnels were simple affairs, just basic hiding spots and storage areas dug into the red clay soil that characterized the region. The Viet Minh had learned from experience that the French, with their superior weapons and firepower, could devastate any fixed position. Villages could be burned, fortifications could be destroyed with artillery, and anywhere the Vietnamese tried to make a stand, French forces could overwhelm them with concentrated firepower. But underground, the French advantages diminished. Artillery and aerial bombing were far less effective against tunnels. Soldiers could hide from bombardment, then emerge after the barrage ended to continue fighting. Supplies could be stored safely underground, protected from airstrikes and artillery fire. The tunnels provided sanctuary, protection, and a way to remain in an area even when surface control was contested or lost. These early tunnels proved their value during the First Indochina War. The Viet Minh used them extensively during the Long Campaign that eventually led to the French defeat at Dien Bien Phu in 1954. When the French finally withdrew from Vietnam after that catastrophic battle, the tunnels remained. The local population remembered them, remembered how they had helped resist foreign occupation. That knowledge would prove crucial when conflict returned to Vietnam. The Geneva Accords of 1954 temporarily partitioned Vietnam at the 17th parallel, with the Communist North under Ho Chi Minh and the South under a government supported by the United States. But peace didn't last. By the late 1950s and early 1960s, communist insurgents in the South, who became known as the Viet Cong, began an armed campaign against the Saigon government. They needed bases, supply depots, and safe havens in the South. And they remembered the tunnels. The Viet Cong returned to Cu Chi and began expanding the tunnel system on a massive scale. What had been a network of simple hiding holes was transformed into something extraordinary. This expansion happened gradually, over years, with work continuing even as American forces began arriving in Vietnam in larger numbers. The digging was done, entirely by hand, mostly at night to avoid detection. Viet Cong soldiers and local villagers, including women and children, worked in shifts, using simple tools like hoes, shovels, and baskets to remove the excavated soil. The location was strategically perfect. Cu Chi sat in a region known as the Iron Triangle, a Viet Cong stronghold that formed a natural corridor from the Cambodian border down towards Saigon. The area was heavily forested with thick jungle canopy that provided cover from aerial observation. But more importantly, the soil itself was ideal for tunnel construction. The hard red clay, called laterite, was easy to dig when wet but dried to an almost concrete-like hardness. It could support elaborate underground structures without requiring timber reinforcement, which would have been difficult to obtain and install covertly. The clay also had another crucial advantage. During the dry season, it became so hard that it could withstand significant amounts of explosive force without collapsing. American demolition teams would discover this frustratingly. They could set charges in a tunnel section and detonate them, only to find that while that specific section had collapsed, the rest of the tunnel system remained intact. The hard clay contained the blast, preventing it from propagating through the tunnels and causing widespread destruction. By the mid-1960s, the Cu Chi tunnel system had evolved into something extraordinary. This wasn't just a network of passages. It was an entire underground city, a subterranean world where thousands of people could live, work, fight, and survive. The complexity and scale of the system was staggering. At its peak, the tunnels extended over 150 miles, though not all in one continuous system. Rather, there were multiple interconnected networks, some covering just a few square miles, others extending for dozens of miles. The tunnels existed on multiple levels, like a multi-story building buried in the earth. The first level, usually about 10 to 12 feet below the surface, contained the main passages and most of the living and working spaces. Below that, a second level at around 20 feet depth provided additional passages and rooms, and in some areas, a third level extended as deep as 30 feet underground, providing maximum protection from bombs and artillery. These levels were connected by steep vertical shafts with crude steps carved into the walls. Moving between levels was difficult and dangerous, especially in the dark. A Viet Cong soldier carrying supplies down to a lower level had to descend carefully, feeling for each step, often with a heavy load on his back. One slip could mean a fall that resulted in broken bones or death. The main tunnels were typically only about 2 to 3 feet wide and 3 to 4 feet high. This wasn't an accident or a limitation of construction techniques. The Viet Cong designed them specifically to fit the smaller average, build of Vietnamese fighters while making it extremely difficult for larger American soldiers to navigate. A Vietnamese soldier, whose average height was around 5 feet 6 inches and average weight around 130 pounds, could move through these passages in a low crouch, moving relatively quickly. An American soldier, averaging around 5 feet 10 inches and 170 pounds, had to crawl on his stomach, unable to turn around, barely able to move forward. This design feature was psychological warfare in itself. It ensured that any American who entered the tunnels would be uncomfortable, constrained, and at a severe disadvantage. The physical stress of crawling through such tight spaces, combined with the psychological stress of being underground in the dark, gave the Viet Cong a massive home field advantage. But the tunnels also featured even smaller passages. Connector tunnels between levels might be only 18 inches wide. These were called firing tunnels or fighting tunnels, and they had a specific purpose. A Viet Cong defender could retreat into one of these extremely narrow passages where even a small American couldn't possibly follow. The defender could then fire from this protected position at anyone trying to pursue through the main tunnel, completely safe from return fire because the Americans couldn't fit into the narrow passage to shoot back. Throughout the system, the Viet Cong installed trapdoors that were ingeniously camouflaged and almost impossible to detect from above. These trapdoors were masterpieces of practical engineering. They were typically made from wood or woven bamboo, cut to fit precisely into the opening, then covered with a layer of soil and leaf litter that matched the surrounding jungle floor exactly. Some had handles on the underside so they could be pulled closed from below. Others were balanced so precisely that they would fall back into place automatically after someone passed through, leaving no trace. The camouflage was so effective that American soldiers could walk directly over a trapdoor without knowing it was there. The Viet Cong would watch through tiny observation slits as American patrols passed overhead, sometimes just a few feet above them. Then, once the patrol had moved on, they would emerge from the tunnels, conduct their operations, and disappear underground again before American forces could respond. Inside the tunnel system, the Viet Cong had constructed an entire underground society. They built living quarters, cramped chambers barely large enough for a man to lie down in, where soldiers would sleep in shifts. Some of these sleeping chambers had crude wooden platforms to keep soldiers off the damp earth, while others were just alcoves carved into the tunnel walls, where men would curl up on straw mats. They built weapons factories where workers assembled mines, booby traps, and munitions using salvage materials and smuggled supplies. These underground workshops were equipped with simple hand tools and operated entirely by lamplight, Workers would spend hours in these cramped, poorly ventilated spaces, assembling deadly devices that would later be used against American forces. The work was dangerous. Accidents with explosives in the confined tunnel spaces could be catastrophic, killing not just the careless worker, but potentially collapsing entire tunnel sections. Storage depots held weapons, ammunition, rice, and other supplies. Some of these storage chambers were quite large, perhaps 8 feet by 10 feet, with shelves carved into the walls to maximize space. Others were simple alcoves where supplies were stacked. The Viet Cong went to great lengths to protect these supplies from the damp environment. Rice was stored in ceramic pots sealed with wax. Ammunition was wrapped in banana leaves and stored in wooden boxes. Weapons were regularly oiled to prevent rust. The tunnels included hospitals, or what passed for hospitals in these primitive conditions. These were slightly larger chambers where wounded fighters could be treated. Medical care in the tunnels was crude by modern standards. There were no antibiotics, no anesthesia, no surgical equipment beyond the most basic tools. Doctors and medics worked by lamplight or even candlelight, performing surgeries and treating wounds under conditions that would horrify modern medical professionals. Many wounded soldiers died of infection, despite the best efforts of the medical staff. The tunnels even had kitchens, though cooking underground presented unique challenges. Smoke from cooking fires could give away tunnel locations to American forces searching for them. So, the Viet Cong developed elaborate ventilation systems. They built cooking chambers at the end of long, twisting passages that would dissipate smoke before it reached the surface. They designed vents that emerged far from the kitchen locations, disguised to look like termite mounds or natural features of the landscape. Some cooking was done only at times when American forces were known to be far away, or when weather conditions would help disperse smoke. Meeting rooms allowed commanders to plan operations. These were among the larger chambers in the tunnel system, perhaps able to hold a dozen people sitting on the floor. Here, Viet Cong officers would gather to discuss strategy, plan attacks, and coordinate with other units. Maps were spread on the dirt floor, dimly lit by oil lamps. Messengers would arrive with reports from other tunnel complexes or from observation posts on the surface. Decisions made in these underground rooms would lead to operations that killed American soldiers and shaped the course of the war. The tunnels even included some surprising features. Some sections had theaters, small chambers where propaganda performances could be held for the troops. Cultural activities were seen as important for morale, so soldiers would gather to watch plays or musical performances put on by other soldiers. The performances were crude by any standard, but in the darkness and isolation of the tunnels, they provided a psychological boost, a reminder of culture and normal life. Some tunnel complexes included wells for drinking water. These were vertical shafts dug down to the water table, allowing soldiers to draw water without having to surface. The wells were typically located in larger chambers where the water could be raised in buckets. The water was often contaminated and had to be boiled before drinking, but having an internal water source meant a tunnel complex could sustain its population even during extended sieges. Ventilation was a constant challenge. The Viet Cong built air shafts throughout the system, narrow tubes that extended from the lower levels to the surface, providing fresh air circulation. These vents were carefully disguised, and their openings were usually far from the main tunnel entrances to avoid giving away the location of the complex. Some vents were built in a zigzag pattern to prevent blast waves from bombs or grenades from traveling down the shaft. Others had baffles or filters to reduce the amount of gas or smoke that could be pumped into the tunnels. The entire system was designed with defense in mind. Blast walls were built into many tunnel sections. These were thick walls of earth left in place at strategic locations in the tunnels. If a grenade was thrown into a tunnel, or if Americans managed to detonate explosives in a section, the blast wall would contain the explosion, preventing it from propagating through the system. The blast wall also served as a fallback position during attacks, a strong point that defenders could retreat behind. Trapdoors within the tunnel system allowed sections to be sealed off. If one part of the complex was compromised, these internal doors could be closed, preventing American forces from accessing the rest of the system. Some of these trapdoors were disguised to look like dead ends in the tunnel, appearing to be nothing more than solid walls until you knew the trick to opening them. The Viet Cong also built false tunnels, dead-end passages that appeared to be main routes but actually led nowhere. These served multiple purposes. They could waste an enemy's time and energy as they explored the false passage. They could be used to lure attackers into kill zones where defenders could ambush them. And they created confusion about the actual layout of the complex, making it harder for Americans to map and understand the tunnel system. Living in these tunnels was incredibly difficult. The conditions were harsh by any measure. The air was stale and often oxygen depleted, especially in the deeper levels where ventilation was poorest. The humidity was oppressive, often approaching 100%. Everything was constantly damp. Clothing never fully dried. Fungal infections were endemic. Respiratory diseases spread quickly in the close quarters. The darkness was absolute when lamps were extinguished. The Viet Cong had to conserve lamp oil and candles. So much of the time, soldiers lived in complete darkness. They learned to navigate their local section of tunnels by touch and memory, feeling their way along familiar passages. But this existence in darkness took a psychological toll. Some soldiers developed eye problems from the constant strain of trying to see in minimal light. Others experienced psychological issues related to the sensory deprivation. Food was scarce, supplies had to be carried into the tunnels, and during periods when American forces controlled the surface, resupply was difficult or impossible. Soldiers lived on minimal rations, often just rice and whatever vegetables or protein could be obtained. Malnutrition was common. Many Viet Cong soldiers in the tunnels were chronically underweight and suffered from vitamin deficiencies. Disease was a constant threat. In addition to respiratory problems and fungal infections, soldiers dealt with dysentery, malaria, and parasitic infections. The primitive sanitation facilities and close living quarters meant diseases spread rapidly. The crude medical facilities in the tunnels could provide only basic care. Many soldiers died of diseases that would have been easily treatable in a proper hospital. Yet, thousands of Viet Cong soldiers lived in these tunnels for months or even years at a time. Some soldiers spent so long underground that their eyes became permanently damaged and they could no longer tolerate bright sunlight. Their skin became pale from lack of sun exposure. Their bodies weakened from malnutrition and disease. But they endured because they believed in their cause and because they had no alternative. The tunnels were their sanctuary, their fortress, and their home. The psychological resilience required to live in these conditions is difficult for most people to comprehend. These were not superhuman individuals. They were ordinary people, farmers and villagers, and students who had joined the Viet Cong for various reasons. Some were true believers in the communist cause. Others were motivated by nationalism and resistance to foreign occupation. Some had joined because their families or villages had been harmed by American or South Vietnamese forces and they wanted revenge. Others had been conscripted and had little choice in the matter. But regardless of their motivations for joining, all of them had to adapt to life underground. They had to learn to sleep in cramped, damp chambers. They had to learn to eat minimal rations and maintain their strength. They had to learn to function in near total darkness. They had to learn to cope with the psychological stress of knowing that at any moment, American forces might discover their tunnel complex and attack. They had to live with the constant possibility that bombs or artillery might collapse the tunnels, burying them alive. And yet, they built a society. Underground, they celebrated birthdays and holidays in the tunnels. They fell in love and formed relationships despite the impossible conditions. They created art and music and culture in the darkness. They maintained discipline and military organization. They held political education sessions and discussed communist theory. They supported each other through the hardships and kept each other's spirits up during the worst times. The tunnel system represented more than just a military asset. It represented the Vietnamese will to resist, their determination to outlast any foreign occupier, no matter the cost. The willingness to live underground in conditions that most people would find unbearable demonstrated a level of commitment that American forces consistently underestimated. American military planners couldn't comprehend why the Viet Cong didn't just surrender when faced with overwhelming American firepower. The tunnels helped explain why. Because the Viet Cong had created a space where American firepower didn't matter, where they could survive and resist and continue fighting no matter what happened on the surface. When American forces finally discovered the extent of the tunnel system, the initial reaction was shock and disbelief. Intelligence had known the Viet Cong were using tunnels, but no one had imagined the scale and complexity of what had been built. As soldiers began exploring captured tunnel complexes, they found entire underground cities that had existed right beneath American base camps and patrol routes. The realization that thousands of enemy soldiers had been living and operating just beneath their feet was deeply unsettling. The American military faced a serious problem. How do you fight an enemy that can disappear underground at will? How do you secure territory when the enemy can pop up anywhere through hidden trapdoors? How do you destroy tunnel systems that extend for miles underground? The conventional American approach to warfare, based on superior firepower and technology, was ineffective against the tunnels. Bombing runs and artillery barrages couldn't destroy something buried so deep underground. Chemical weapons had limited effectiveness in the complex, multi-level tunnel systems, with their blast walls and sealed sections. The only way to truly deal with the tunnels was to go inside them, to explore them, map them, understand them, and destroy them from within. And that meant someone had to volunteer to crawl down into those black holes in the ground, into spaces specifically designed to trap and kill intruders. Someone had to face the darkness, the claustrophobia, the booby traps, and the enemy soldiers waiting in that darkness. The tunnel rats answered that call. But before we can understand their story, we need to understand what the American military's initial response to the tunnels was, and how the tunnel rat program evolved from those early, chaotic attempts to deal with this underground threat. The American military discovered the existence of the Q Chai tunnels almost by accident, and the initial response revealed how unprepared American forces were for this type of warfare. In January 1966, the 1st Infantry Division and the 173rd Airborne Brigade launched Operation Crimp, a major sweep through the Q Chi area intended to clear out Viet Cong forces. Intelligence suggested there was significant enemy presence in the region, but no one fully understood what that meant. As American soldiers moved through the area, conducting standard search and destroy operations, they began finding strange things, small trapdoors hidden in the ground, often discovered only by accident when a soldier's foot broke through the camouflage, or when a dog handler's animal alerted on a spot. When soldiers looked inside these trapdoors, they saw passages leading down into darkness. Most had no idea what they were looking at. Were these just individual hiding holes, small cache sites? No one initially conceived that these might be entrances to a vast underground network. The first American soldiers who went down into the tunnels did so with no training, no proper equipment, and no real understanding of what they might encounter. They were simply infantry soldiers following orders to check out these mysterious holes in the ground. Many of these early explorations ended badly. Soldiers got stuck in narrow passages. They triggered booby traps. Some encountered Viet Cong soldiers in the tunnels and were killed in the resulting firefights. Others panicked from claustrophobia and had to be pulled back out by their comrades. Lieutenant Colonel James Roseberry, commanding officer of the 1st Brigade, 25th Infantry Division, later described the chaos of those early tunnel encounters. His troops would find a tunnel entrance and someone would have to go check it out. But they had no procedures, no specialized equipment, and no training for this type of operation. Soldiers would volunteer or be volunteered by their sergeants, and they'd go down with a rifle and a flashlight. More often than not, they'd come back up after just a few minutes, reporting that the tunnel went too deep or was too narrow, or they'd heard sounds ahead and didn't want to proceed further. The initial American approach to dealing with the tunnels was simple and brutal. When they found a tunnel entrance, they would try to destroy it. The method they called blow it and forget it. Engineers would pump tear gas into the openings, trying to drive out anyone hiding below. Then they would throw grenades down the shafts, hoping to kill anyone inside or collapse the tunnel. Finally, they would use demolition charges to try to destroy the entrance and collapse the passages. But these methods proved frustratingly ineffective. The tunnels were too extensive and too well designed to be destroyed this easily. The multiple levels and complex layout meant that destroying one section rarely affected the rest of the system. A grenade might collapse 10 or 15 feet of tunnel, but the rest of the complex, potentially miles of passages, remained intact. The Viet Cong would simply dig around the collapsed section or open another entrance from a different location. American forces tried more aggressive techniques. They brought in specialized teams to pump acetylene gas into tunnel systems and then ignite it, hoping to create underground explosions that would destroy entire complexes. The results were disappointing. The blast walls and sealed sections that the Viet Cong had built into their tunnels prevented the explosions from propagating through the system. A massive explosion might destroy one section, but have no effect on sections 50 or 100 feet away. They tried pumping water into the tunnels, attempting to flood them out. This worked in some cases, particularly in the dry season when the water table was low, but the Viet Cong had built drainage systems into many tunnel complexes, specifically to deal with flooding during the monsoon season. And in areas where flooding was effective, the Viet Cong would simply wait for the water to drain or be pumped out, then return and rebuild. The Americans even experimented with chemical warfare. They used CS gas, a riot control agent, pumping huge quantities into tunnel systems, trying to make them uninhabitable. The Viet Cong learned to defend against this by wearing crude gas masks or simply retreating to deeper levels of the tunnels where ventilation would eventually clear the gas. Some tunnel complexes had sealed rooms specifically designed as refuges during gas attacks, spaces where the doors could be closed and wet cloths stuffed in the cracks to keep the gas out, while the rest of the complex was contaminated. More controversially, there were limited uses of more lethal chemical agents. The exact details remain classified, but historical records suggest that, in some cases, particularly toxic gases were employed in attempts to permanently contaminate tunnel complexes. These operations were kept quiet because of international laws against chemical weapons use. But even these extreme measures proved ineffective. The Viet Cong would abandon a contaminated section and simply seal it off, continuing to use the rest of the complex. Major Randy Ellis, an engineer officer involved in early tunnel destruction efforts, later described the frustration American forces felt. They would expend enormous resources attacking a tunnel complex, using thousands of pounds of explosives, tons of gas, and days of effort. Intelligence would report the complex destroyed. Then, within weeks, reconnaissance would reveal that the Viet Cong were using the same complex again. The enemy would repair damage faster than Americans could inflict it. More importantly, American commanders began to realize they were missing crucial intelligence opportunities. When you destroy AID's tunnel complex without exploring it first, you lose everything inside. Documents that might reveal enemy plans, maps showing other tunnel locations, weapons caches, supply information, communication equipment. Prisoner interrogations had revealed that the tunnels contained valuable intelligence materials, but the blow-it-and-forget-it approach was destroying this intelligence before it could be recovered. General William Dupuy, commanding general of the 1st Infantry Division, recognized that a new approach was needed. Simply destroying tunnels without understanding them wasn't working. The military needed to explore the tunnels, map them, recover intelligence from them, and then destroy them in a more systematic way. But this required sending people down into the tunnels, and that required volunteers. The call went out in early 1966. Infantry units in the Xiu Chi area were asked for volunteers to conduct tunnel exploration missions. The requirements were simple. You had to be small enough to fit through narrow passages. You had to be willing to go underground into potentially hostile tunnel systems, and you had to be able to function in extremely stressful conditions. The response was mixed. Some soldiers immediately volunteered, motivated by a desire for adventure, a sense of duty, or simply a break from the monotony of regular infantry operations. Others flat out refused, and no one blamed them. Going down into enemy tunnels armed with only a pistol and a flashlight was clearly suicidal to many soldiers. There was no shame in declining. The mission was entirely voluntary, and soldiers who chose not to volunteer faced no consequences. Those who did volunteer came from all backgrounds. Some were city kids from New York or Chicago. Others were farm boys from the Midwest or South. Some were college-educated draftees. Others had enlisted right out of high school. What they had in common was a certain psychological makeup. They were men who could control fear, who could force themselves to do things that terrified them, and who had enough confidence in their own abilities to believe they could survive situations that would kill most people. The first formal tunnel rat unit was established in early 1966 as part of the 1st Infantry Division's operations in Qiu Chai. It wasn't really a unit in the traditional sense. There was no official table of organization and equipment, no special designation, no separate command structure. Tunnel rats were simply infantry soldiers who had volunteered for additional duty. They remained part of their regular companies, but would be called upon when tunnel missions were needed. Initially, there was no training program. The Army didn't have a manual for fighting in underground tunnels. There were no instructors who had experience in this type of combat. So, the first tunnel rats learned on the job, through trial and error, and by sharing information with each other about what worked and what didn't. The early missions were chaotic and dangerous. Tunnel rats would be called to a location where infantry had discovered a tunnel entrance. They would gather what minimal equipment they had, a pistol, a flashlight, maybe a knife, and they would go down. Often they had no idea what they were getting into. Was this a small cache site or a major complex? Were there Viet Cong soldiers down there, or was it abandoned? How extensive were the tunnels? No one knew until someone went down to find out. These early tunnel rats developed techniques through necessity. They learned to move slowly and silently, testing each handhold and foothold before committing their weight. They learned to use their flashlights sparingly, just quick bursts of light to check what was ahead. Because a light advertised your position to anyone waiting in the darkness. They learned to listen intently, trying to pick up any sound that might indicate an enemy presence. Breathing. Movement. The click of a weapon being readied. They learned what equipment to carry and what to leave behind. Rifles were too long and cumbersome in the tight tunnels. Most rats switched to pistols as their primary weapon. The standard issue. 1911. Colt 45 was popular because of its stopping power. In a tunnel firefight at point-blank range, you wanted a weapon that would put an enemy down with 1 or 2 shots. Some rats preferred revolvers, particularly .38 caliber models, because they were simpler and less likely to jam. Rats experimented with different light sources. The standard angle head flashlight worked but was somewhat bulky. Some rats brought smaller flashlights or even pen lights as backups. A few tried chemical light sticks, which had the advantage of providing light without batteries. But the light was too dim for effective use in the pitch-black tunnels. They learned that less equipment was better. Standard combat gear, load-bearing equipment, extra ammunition pouches, canteens, all of that had to be left on the surface. It would snag on roots and rocks in the tunnels and make movement difficult or impossible. Most rats went down wearing just pants and a t-shirt, carrying only their pistol, flashlight, and maybe a knife. Some carried a length of rope or communications wire. Some brought grenades, though these were controversial, because using a grenade in a confined tunnel could be as dangerous to the thrower as to the intended target. Through these early missions, certain individuals emerged as particularly skilled tunnel rats. Sergeant Arnold Gutierrez became known in his battalion for his ability to navigate complex tunnel systems and his uncanny sense for detecting booby traps. Private First Class. Jimmy Thornton developed a reputation for being able to move silently through tunnels and for having exceptional hearing that allowed him to detect enemy soldiers in the darkness. Sergeant Robert Cruz was known for his courage under fire. After several instances where he encountered and killed Viet Cong soldiers in tunnel firefights, these experienced rats became informal instructors, teaching new volunteers what they had learned. They would take a new rat on his first mission, showing him techniques for movement, how to use the flashlight, what to listen for, how to recognize different types of booby traps. This mentorship system was crucial because it allowed knowledge to be passed down and helped new rats survive their initial missions when they were most vulnerable. By mid-1966, tunnel rat operations had become more organized. Units operating in areas where tunnels were common began designating specific soldiers as their tunnel rats. These men would receive slightly more formal training, though still nothing like an official school. Captain Herb Thornton, who commanded tunnel rat operations in Kyu Chai, developed a basic training program for his rats. He would take volunteers down to a safe tunnel that had already been cleared and searched. Just a test run to see how they reacted to being underground. He would watch how they moved, whether their hands shook, whether they started breathing too fast, whether they showed signs of panic or claustrophobia. He estimated that more than half the volunteers never went down a second time after that first practice run. They would come back up from the safe tunnel and quietly withdraw their names from the volunteer list. No shame in it. They had simply discovered they couldn't handle the psychological pressure, and it was better to find that out in a safe tunnel than in a hostile one with Viet Cong waiting in the darkness. Those who continued received what additional training could be provided. Thornton had them practice moving through narrow spaces, teaching them techniques for crawling efficiently while carrying equipment. He had them practice using their pistols in confined spaces, teaching them to fire from awkward positions while lying on their stomach or side. He showed them diagrams of tunnel layouts that had been mapped by previous rats, teaching them the typical design patterns the Viet Cong used so they could better anticipate what they might encounter. He also provided what psychological preparation he could. He would talk to new rats about what to expect underground, the darkness, the fear, the claustrophobia. He would explain that these feelings were normal, that every rat experienced them, and that the key was to control the fear rather than let it control you. He would describe what tunnel combat was like, the sudden encounters in pitch darkness where you had only seconds to react. He tried to prepare them mentally for the experience of killing another human being at point-blank range in a situation where there was no time for hesitation or mercy. But Thornton admitted later that no amount of training could truly prepare someone for what tunnel duty was really like. You couldn't simulate the psychological pressure of crawling through a hostile tunnel, knowing that the next inch might contain a booby trap or an enemy soldier. You couldn't replicate the feeling of being deep underground with tons of earth above you, and only one way out. The only way to prepare for tunnel rat duty was to do it, and the first few missions were always the hardest, because that's when rats learned whether they could actually handle it. The tunnel rats developed their own culture and identity. They were a small, specialized group doing a job that most soldiers couldn't or wouldn't do. This created a strong sense of camaraderie and mutual respect. Rats from different units would share information when they met, trading stories about tunnels they had explored, techniques they had developed, and booby traps they had encountered. They developed their own slang and terminology for aspects of tunnel work. A tunnel section that was particularly narrow was a squeeze. A booby trap was a surprise. An encounter with a Viet Cong soldier in the tunnels was meeting Charlie in the dark. They also developed a certain swagger and pride in their work. They knew they were doing something extraordinary, something that required more courage than most combat operations. When rats returned to their units after a mission, other soldiers would look at them with a mixture of respect and incomprehension. What kind of person volunteers to crawl into enemy tunnels? The tunnel rats cultivated a bit of mystique around their work, and some enjoyed the reputation as slightly crazy, but undeniably brave. But beneath the swagger was genuine trauma. Every tunnel rat dealt with intense psychological stress, the constant exposure to life-threatening danger, the claustrophobia, the sensory deprivation, the violence of close-quarters combat. All of this took a toll. Some rats developed coping mechanisms. Dark humor was common, joking about death and danger as a way to process fear. Others became superstitious, developing rituals they believed would protect them. Some became fatalistic, believing survival was entirely luck-based, and there was nothing they could do to improve their odds. The military provided no psychological support for tunnel rats. There were no counselors, no debriefings after difficult missions, no system for recognizing when a rat was reaching his breaking point. Soldiers were expected to be tough, to handle whatever came their way without complaining. Mental health issues were stigmatized, seen as weakness rather than legitimate injuries. So tunnel rats suffered in silence, dealing with their trauma privately, or sometimes turning to alcohol or drugs to numb the psychological pain. Some rats reached their limit and simply stopped volunteering for missions. They would tell their sergeant or commanding officer that they couldn't do it anymore, and that would be respected. No one forced a soldier to continue as a tunnel rat once he decided he was done. But for those who continued, the stress accumulated with each mission. They might handle their 10th tunnel mission okay, but by their 30th or 50th, the psychological wear and tear became severe. Nightmares, flashbacks, panic attacks, hypervigilance, all the symptoms of what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder. The casualty rates for tunnel rats were difficult to track because they were never a formally recognized unit. But anecdotal evidence from individual battalions suggests the rates were extremely high. Some estimates suggest that tunnel rats had a 50% casualty rate, meaning that over the course of their deployment, half of all tunnel rats would be killed or wounded severely enough to require evacuation. This was far higher than the casualty rates for regular infantry, which were themselves quite high in the intense combat environment of Vietnam. Despite the danger and the psychological toll, new volunteers kept coming forward. Some were motivated by a sense of adventure or a desire to do something important. Others volunteered because they respected the existing rats and wanted to join this elite group. Some saw it as a way to gain recognition or advance in rank, and some simply felt that tunnel duty was important work that needed to be done, and they were willing to do their part. By 1967, tunnel rat operations had become a regular part of American military activities in areas where the Viet Cong tunnel networks were extensive. Multiple divisions had their own tunnel rat teams, and techniques and information were being shared between units. The tunnel rats had evolved from a handful of volunteers on an experimental mission to a recognized, though still informal, specialization within the infantry. But even as the tunnel rats became more organized and experienced, the challenges they faced underground remained as deadly as ever. The Viet Cong were adapting too, creating new defenses and booby traps specifically designed to kill tunnel rats. The underground war was escalating, and the men who fought it were about to face their greatest challenges yet. The Viet Cong were not passive defenders of their tunnel systems. As American tunnel rats became more active in exploring and destroying tunnels, the Vietnamese responded by dramatically improving their defensive measures. The underground war evolved into an arms race of sorts, with each side developing new techniques and countermeasures. For the tunnel rats, this meant facing an ever-growing array of deadly traps and obstacles specifically designed to kill or maim anyone who entered the tunnels without authorization. The most basic tunnel defense was simplicity itself, darkness and silence. A Viet Cong soldier who heard an American entering the tunnel system could simply extinguish all lights, remain perfectly still, and wait. The American, crawling forward with his flashlight, would be announcing his position with every burst of light, while the Vietnamese soldier, eyes adapted to the dark and intimately familiar with every inch of the tunnel, could prepare an ambush or simply let the American pass by before slipping away through a passage the intruder didn't know existed. But the Viet Cong developed far more elaborate defenses than simple ambushes. They created an extensive array of booby traps, each one carefully designed to exploit the physical and psychological vulnerabilities of men crawling through confined spaces in darkness. These traps served multiple purposes. They killed or injured American soldiers directly. They slowed down tunnel exploration by forcing rats to move cautiously and check for traps constantly. And perhaps most importantly, they created intense psychological pressure, making every inch of tunnel a potential death trap, and wearing down the mental resilience of even the most experienced rats. The simplest booby traps were variants of the Viet Cong's surface weapons. A grenade would be placed in a small alcove in the tunnel wall, with its pin partially pulled and held in place by a tripwire stretched across the passage at knee or waist height. A tunnel rat crawling forward in the dark might brush against the wire without even feeling it. The wire would pull the pin completely out, and after a 3 to 5 second delay, the grenade would detonate. In the confined space of a tunnel, a grenade explosion was catastrophic. The blast wave, with nowhere to dissipate, would propagate down the tunnel with tremendous force. Even if the shrapnel didn't hit you directly, the overpressure could rupture eardrums, cause internal bleeding, collapse lungs, and induce severe concussions. Tunnel rats who survived grenade blasts in tunnels often emerge with severe blast injuries, bleeding from their ears and nose, sometimes permanently deaf, sometimes with brain injuries that affected them for the rest of their lives. The Viet Cong became incredibly creative with tripwire placement. They would string wires at multiple heights, forcing a rat to watch not just where he was crawling, but also to check overhead and along the sides. Some wires were made from transparent fishing line that was almost impossible to see even with a flashlight. Others were camouflaged to blend with roots hanging from the tunnel ceiling. A rat might spend 5 minutes carefully checking the tunnel ahead for wires, miss one transparent fishing line in the tangle of roots and soil, and die from his momentary oversight. More sophisticated versions involved multiple grenades daisy-chained together, trigger one wire, and 3 or 4 grenades would detonate simultaneously, ensuring that even blast walls wouldn't contain the explosion. Some of these complex traps were designed so that disarming the first grenade would automatically trigger a second one, killing anyone who thought they had successfully neutralized the trap. The Viet Cong also employed punji stake traps underground, adapted from the versions used on the surface. They would dig a false floor in a tunnel section, covering it with a thin layer of bamboo and dirt that looked solid but would collapse under the weight of a person. Below was a pit, typically 3 to 6 feet deep, lined with sharpened bamboo stakes pointing upward. A tunnel rat crawling forward would suddenly break through the false floor and fall onto the stakes. The stakes themselves were instruments of horror. They were sharpened to needle points capable of penetrating boots and clothing. They were angled so that a falling person would be impaled on multiple stakes. And most diabolically, they were often smeared with human feces or animal dung. Even if the stakes didn't cause immediately fatal injuries, the contamination virtually guaranteed serious infection. In the pre-antibiotic conditions of field medicine in remote locations, these infections could be lethal. Some punji pits were more elaborate, with stakes on all 4 walls as well as the bottom, creating a cage of sharpened bamboo that would impale a victim from multiple angles. The psychological impact of falling into one of these pits was severe. The sudden collapse of the floor, the brief moment of free fall in pitch darkness, then the agony of being impaled on multiple stakes, unable to move without driving the stakes deeper into your flesh. Tunnel rats who survived such traps were often so traumatized they could never go underground again. The Viet Cong employed venomous snakes as living booby traps, exploiting the natural fear most people have of serpents. Vietnam is home to numerous venomous snake species, including the bamboo viper, the many-banded crate, and several species of cobra. The Viet Cong would capture these snakes alive and place them strategically in the tunnels. One method was to place a snake in a small bamboo tube or ceramic pot attached to the tunnel ceiling near the entrance. A tripwire connected to the container meant that when an intruder triggered the wire, the container would tip or open, dropping the agitated snake onto the person below. In pitch darkness, a tunnel rat might feel something land on his back or neck, then feel the burning pain of a bite, but not even know what had bitten him until he could get back to the surface and examine the wound. The psychological warfare aspect of the snake traps was as important as the physical danger. Even experienced tunnel rats who knew about the snake traps would feel increased anxiety crawling through tunnels where they might encounter serpents. Every time something brushed against them in the dark, whether a root, a piece of equipment, or just their imagination, they would flinch and wonder if it was a snake. This constant low-level anxiety accumulated over time, adding to the overall psychological stress of tunnel duty. The venom of different snake species caused different symptoms. Bamboo viper venom caused severe pain, massive swelling, tissue necrosis, and sometimes death if untreated. Crate venom was a neurotoxin that caused paralysis, starting with the extremities and progressing to the respiratory muscles. Without treatment, victims would suffocate as their lungs stopped functioning. Cobra venom combined neurotoxic and cytotoxic effects, causing both paralysis and tissue damage. For a tunnel rat bitten deep underground, far from medical help, any of these bites could be a death sentence. Treatment options were limited. Some tunnel rat teams carried basic snakebite kits with suction devices and compression bandages, but these were of limited effectiveness against many venoms. The best treatment was rapid evacuation to a field hospital where anti-venom could be administered. But getting a bitten rat out of a deep tunnel system quickly enough was often impossible. Some rats died underground from snake bites, unable to crawl back to the entrance before the venom took full effect. The Viet Cong also used scorpions as biological weapons. The Vietnamese giant forest scorpion can grow over 6 inches long and delivers an intensely painful sting. While rarely lethal to healthy adults, the sting causes severe pain, swelling, numbness, and sometimes convulsions. Multiple stings could incapacitate a person, and in the confined space of a tunnel with limited access to medical care, even non-lethal effects could be dangerous. Scorpions would be placed in small clay pots or bamboo tubes buried in the tunnel walls at hand level, about where a rat crawling through would naturally place his hands for support. Reaching for a handhold in the darkness, a rat would thrust his fingers into a container full of angry scorpions. The pain of multiple scorpion stings on the hands and fingers was excruciating, and the swelling could make it difficult or impossible to hold a weapon or use a flashlight effectively. The psychological impact was, again, as important as the physical. After encountering a scorpion trap once, a tunnel rat would become paranoid about every handhold. He would have to feel carefully before committing his weight, slowing his progress to a crawl, and increasing the time he spent in the dangerous tunnel environment. This wore down not just the individual rat, but the entire tunnel rat program because missions took longer and required more man-hours to accomplish the same objectives. The Viet Cong built water traps in sections of tunnels that could be deliberately flooded. These were particularly insidious because they could be activated remotely or set to trigger automatically. A typical water trap involved a chamber located above the tunnel passages, filled with water from groundwater seepage or from surface water pumped in during the rainy season. This chamber had gates or removable barriers that could be opened to release the water. When a Viet Cong defender knew an American was in the tunnel system, he could open these gates, causing water to pour into the passages. For a tunnel rat crawling through a narrow, horizontal tunnel, suddenly finding water rising around him was terrifying. In a passage too narrow to turn around in, with water rising to his neck or over his head, he had to crawl backward toward the entrance as fast as possible, hoping he could reach safety before the water level rose too high. Several tunnel rats drowned in flooded tunnels. Unable to turn around, unable to move quickly enough backward through the narrow passages, they were overtaken by rising water and died underground. Their bodies were often never recovered, remaining in the flooded tunnel systems. The knowledge that some tunnels contained the remains of previous tunnel rats who had drowned added another layer of psychological horror to an already terrifying job. The Viet Cong constructed false tunnels throughout their systems. These were passages that appeared to be main routes, but actually led to dead ends, often ending in a solid wall of earth. The purpose was to waste American time and resources. A tunnel rat might spend an hour or more carefully crawling through a false tunnel, checking for traps, mapping the route, only to discover it went nowhere. Then he would have to crawl backward all the way to the junction where the false tunnel branched off, exhausted and frustrated, before he could continue exploring the actual tunnel system. Some false tunnels were more malicious, ending not in simple dead ends, but in kill zones. The end of the tunnel would have a concealed alcove where a Viet Cong soldier could wait. When the American reached the dead end and paused, trying to figure out what to do next, the Vietnamese soldier would emerge from concealment at point-blank range. Or the dead end itself might be a thin wall concealing a larger chamber where multiple defenders waited in ambush. Another defensive measure was the construction of extremely narrow passages that served as defensive positions. These fighting tunnels or firing tunnels were typically only 15 to 18 inches in diameter, far too small for even a small American to fit through. But a Vietnamese soldier, typically smaller in stature and wearing minimal clothing, could squeeze through with difficulty. These narrow tunnels served multiple tactical purposes. A defender could retreat through one when pursued, knowing the Americans couldn't follow. He could then set up at the far end and fire back down the main tunnel at anyone attempting to pursue, completely safe from return fire because his body was protected in the narrow passage. These positions were nearly impossible to neutralize without specialized equipment or extreme tactics like flooding the entire tunnel system. The Viet Cong also employed psychological warfare directly against tunnel rats. They would leave messages in English written on tunnel walls, trying to demoralize American soldiers. "You will die here," some messages read. "This tunnel is your grave. Turn back or die, American." Whether these messages had any real effect on rat morale is debatable, but they added to the general atmosphere of dread and menace that permeated hostile tunnel systems. More sophisticated psychological operations involved leaving propaganda materials specifically targeted at tunnel rats. Leaflets in English would describe the futility of the American war effort and encourage soldiers to desert or refuse combat orders. Some materials specifically addressed tunnel rats with messages like, "Why do you crawl through our tunnels like rats? We do not want to kill you. Go home to your family. This is not your war." The Viet Cong learned to recognize the sounds Americans made in the tunnels and used this knowledge to prepare defenses. American-made boots had distinctive tread patterns that created specific sounds when scraping against tunnel floors. American soldiers, typically larger and less accustomed to moving in such confined spaces, made more noise than Vietnamese fighters. Their breathing patterns were different. Experienced Viet Cong defenders could hear an American entering the tunnel system and had time to prepare an ambush or escape. Some defenders employed acoustic deception. They would make sounds deliberately to draw Americans toward prepared ambush positions. A few words spoken in Vietnamese, the click of a rifle, footsteps moving away down a tunnel. These sounds would provoke curiosity, or aggressive pursuit from tunnel rats, drawing them into kill zones where the advantage shifted heavily to the defenders. The Viet Cong also adapted their tactics based on lessons learned from encounters with tunnel rats. They began placing booby traps not just at tunnel entrances, which rats learned to check carefully, but deeper in the systems where rats might become complacent after navigating safely for a while. They employed delayed-action booby traps that wouldn't trigger until the American had passed by, then would detonate behind him, collapsing the tunnel and trapping him underground. They built decoy tunnel complexes, small systems that appeared significant, but actually contained little of value except numerous traps. When Americans discovered these decoy complexes and sent rats down to explore them, the rats would encounter heavy resistance and numerous casualties, wasting resources on a tunnel system that had minimal strategic value while the real important complexes nearby remained undiscovered. Perhaps the most effective Viet Cong defense was simply the dedication of soldiers who chose to defend the tunnels rather than abandon them. These tunnel defenders knew they were likely signing their own death warrants by staying to fight underground. In the narrow confines of the tunnels, once combat was joined, usually only one person came back out alive. But they stayed anyway, buying time for comrades to escape, protecting valuable supplies and intelligence materials, and inflicting casualties on the Americans. These defenders exhibited remarkable courage and tactical skill. They knew their tunnel systems intimately, every turn and junction and side passage. They could move in complete darkness by touch and memory. They chose their ambush positions carefully, typically at narrow points or turns where Americans would be most vulnerable. They waited in silence, controlling their breathing, while American tunnel rats crawled closer and closer. Then they would attack with sudden violence at point-blank range. The tunnel rats developed countermeasures to all of these defenses, but it was a constant evolution. Every new booby trap design meant rats had to learn to recognize it and neutralize it. Every new defensive tactic meant developing a counter-tactic. The underground war became increasingly sophisticated as both sides learned from experience and adapted their techniques. But for the individual tunnel rat crawling through a hostile tunnel, all of this tactical evolution meant one thing: every mission was potentially lethal. No matter how experienced you were, no matter how carefully you checked for traps, no matter how well you controlled your fear, there was always a chance that the next inch of tunnel would be your last. That knowledge, that constant awareness of imminent possible death, was the heaviest burden tunnel rats carried. Not the physical weight of equipment, but the psychological weight of knowing that every moment underground might be your final moment alive. The reality of combat in the tunnels was unlike anything else in warfare. All the usual elements of military engagement were stripped away. No squad tactics, no covering fire, no air support, no artillery, no radio communication with headquarters. In the tunnels, combat was reduced to its most primitive and personal form. One man alone in the darkness, armed with a pistol and his wits, facing an enemy who had every advantage of position, knowledge of terrain, and preparation. These encounters were brief, brutal, and psychologically devastating for everyone involved. Most tunnel combat happened at distances measured in feet or even inches. The narrow confines of the tunnels meant that by the time you realized an enemy was present, you were often close enough to touch them. There was no time for careful aim, no time for tactical thinking. Combat was pure instinct and reaction speed. Whoever shot first usually survived. The other person usually didn't. Sergeant Robert Cruz experienced numerous tunnel combat encounters during his deployment. He later described one incident that haunted him for decades. He had been crawling through a tunnel for approximately 30 minutes, using his flashlight sparingly, mostly navigating by touch. The tunnel had made several turns, and Cruz was beginning to lose his sense of direction. He paused at a junction where the tunnel split in two directions, listening intently for any sound that might indicate which passage to explore first. He thought he heard breathing coming from the right-hand passage, but it was so faint he couldn't be sure. It might have been his imagination, might have been his own breathing echoing off the tunnel walls, might have been nothing at all. But Cruz decided to investigate. He turned into the right passage and began crawling forward, moving even more slowly than before, trying to make no sound at all. After about 10 feet, his hand, reaching forward in the darkness, touched something. Not earth, not a root, cloth. And the cloth moved. Cruz's mind processed what was happening in a fraction of a second. He had just touched another person. Enemy, right in front of him. Close enough to touch. His training and instinct took over before conscious thought could even form. Cruz fired his pistol 3 times in rapid succession, aiming at where he knew a human torso would be based on where he had felt the cloth. The muzzle flashes lit up the tunnel in brief strobes of light, giving him disconnected snapshots of what was in front of him. A young Vietnamese man, eyes wide with shock, the impacts of the bullets hitting, blood, then darkness again. Cruz waited, his heart pounding so hard he could hear it, his hands shaking, the ringing in his ears from the gunshots making it hard to hear anything else. He fumbled for his flashlight, found it, turned it on. The body of a Viet Cong soldier lay crumpled in the passage. Cruz could see the 3 bullet wounds in the man's chest. The soldier's rifle lay beside him, unfired. He had been waiting in the darkness, probably heard Cruz approaching, but hadn't had time to bring his weapon to bear before Cruz fired. Cruz stared at the body, his flashlight beam fixed on the dead man's face. He was young, maybe 20 years old. Could have been younger, and Cruz had killed him at a range of approximately 2 feet. Had felt the cloth of the man's shirt before firing. Had seen his face in the muzzle flashes, seen the moment of death. It was the most intimate violence Cruz had ever experienced. Not shooting at distant figures during a firefight, but killing another human being close enough to feel his breath. The psychological impact of such close-range killing was profound. In conventional combat, soldiers often don't see the results of their actions. You fire your rifle at distant targets, and you don't necessarily know if you hit anyone. There's psychological distance that makes it easier to process, but in the tunnels, there was no distance. You saw everything. You were close enough to see the person's expression, to make eye contact in that final moment, to watch them die. That kind of intimate violence left psychological scars that many tunnel rats carried for the rest of their lives. Not all tunnel encounters ended with the American shooting first. Private First Class. Daniel Whitaker was crawling through a tunnel when he encountered a Viet Cong soldier coming from the opposite direction. Both men were surprised, both fumbling for weapons in the cramped space. The Vietnamese soldier managed to fire first, shooting Whitaker in the shoulder. The bullet, fired at point-blank range, passed completely through Whitaker's shoulder and exited out his back. The pain was immediate and excruciating, but Whitaker didn't have time to process it. He was still in a tunnel with an armed enemy just feet away. Fighting through the pain, he brought his own pistol up and returned fire, hitting the Viet Cong soldier multiple times. Both men survived the initial encounter, but Whitaker was now wounded in a hostile tunnel, bleeding heavily, with uncertain escape routes and possibly more enemies nearby. He had to crawl backward to the tunnel entrance, pushing himself with his legs while one arm was essentially useless. Blood was soaking his shirt and making the clay floor of the tunnel slippery. He was losing blood rapidly and starting to feel weak and disoriented, but stopping meant dying, so he forced himself to keep moving. It took him over an hour to crawl back to the entrance, and by the time he reached the surface, he was barely conscious from blood loss. Medics rushed him to a field hospital where surgeons managed to save his life, but he never fully recovered use of his shoulder and was medically evacuated from Vietnam. Whitaker's experience illustrated one of the unique dangers of tunnel combat. If you were wounded underground, evacuating you was extremely difficult. In regular combat, wounded soldiers could be dragged to cover, and medics could reach them quickly. In the tunnels, if you were wounded deep in a complex system, you had to somehow get yourself back to the entrance or die underground. Other tunnel rats couldn't easily help you, because there often wasn't room for 2 people to pass each other in the narrow passages. And bringing stretchers or medical equipment underground was usually impossible. Some wounded tunnel rats did die in the tunnels, unable to crawl back to the surface. Their bodies would be recovered later if the tunnel complex was eventually cleared, or they would remain underground forever, entombed in the darkness. The knowledge that this could happen, that you might die alone in a black hole underground with no one able to reach you or help you, was another psychological burden that tunnel rats had to carry. Not all tunnel encounters involved gunfire. Sometimes combat was even more primitive and brutal. Sergeant Harold Roper was crawling through a tunnel when his flashlight died. The batteries had given out, and his backup light had been lost earlier when he squeezed through a particularly narrow section. He was in complete darkness, deep in a hostile tunnel system, with no way to see. Roper decided to continue forward rather than try to retreat without light. He would feel his way forward, inch by inch, using his hands to navigate. He had crawled perhaps 20 feet in this fashion, when his hand, reaching forward, touched another hand reaching back. In that moment of contact, both men realized what was happening. They were crawling toward each other in the darkness, would meet in this narrow passage, and only one would survive. What followed was a desperate, violent struggle in pitch blackness. Both men dropped their firearms because there was no room to use them effectively. Instead, they fought with hands and knives and anything else they could grab. Roper couldn't see his opponent, could only feel him, hands grabbing his throat, trying to strangle him, a knee driving into his ribs, the slash of a blade cutting his arm. Roper fought back with desperate violence, striking and grappling and biting, doing anything to survive. The fight lasted perhaps 2 minutes, though Roper later said it felt like hours. At some point, his hands found the other man's throat and squeezed. He felt the struggles weaken, felt the body go limp. When he was certain the man was dead, Roper released his grip and lay there in the darkness, gasping for breath, bleeding from multiple cuts, his hands still shaking from the adrenaline and exertion. He had to lie there next to the body in the darkness until he calmed down enough to think clearly. Then he had to figure out how to get back to the tunnel entrance without light, crawling backward past the corpse of the man he had just killed with his bare hands. The psychological trauma of that experience stayed with Roper forever. Decades later, he still had nightmares about fighting in the darkness, about hands reaching for his throat, about the feeling of killing another human being through manual strangulation. Tunnel rats also encountered situations where they couldn't engage the enemy effectively. Specialist William Torres was exploring a tunnel when he heard voices ahead. Vietnamese voices, multiple people talking. He paused, trying to estimate how far ahead they were and how many people there might be. Then he heard sounds that suggested people moving away from him, retreating deeper into the tunnel system. Torres faced a difficult decision. Should he pursue, knowing he might be walking into an ambush? Should he retreat and report what he had found? Should he wait and listen to see if the voices returned? He decided to advance cautiously, moving forward inch by inch, stopping frequently to listen. But after about 50 feet, he reached a point where the tunnel split into 3 separate passages. The voices had stopped, and he had no way of knowing which passage the Viet Cong had taken, or if they had set an ambush in one or more of the passages. Torres made the tactical decision to retreat and report. Sometimes the smart move in tunnel operations was to recognize that you were at a disadvantage and pull back rather than press forward into an increasingly dangerous situation. But Torres felt the frustration that many tunnel rats experienced. The enemy had been right there, just ahead of him, and he couldn't engage them effectively. They knew the tunnels better than him and could disappear whenever they wanted. It felt like fighting shadows. The Viet Cong tunnel defenders faced their own psychological challenges. Waiting in darkness for an American to crawl within range required enormous discipline and courage. Some Vietnamese soldiers found they couldn't handle it. They would hear Americans entering the tunnel, hear the sounds getting closer and closer, and would panic and flee before combat was joined. Others would shoot too soon, firing at sounds in the darkness and giving away their position before they could confirm a target. But experienced Viet Cong tunnel defenders were formidable opponents. They knew to control their breathing, to wait until the absolute last moment before firing, to choose their ambush positions carefully. They knew which junctions and turns in the tunnels were ideal for ambushes. They knew how to use the acoustic properties of the tunnels to confuse Americans about where sounds were coming from. They knew how to retreat through narrow passages and side tunnels that Americans didn't know existed. One Viet Cong defender, who was later captured and interrogated, described his experience of tunnel combat. He had been assigned to defend a major tunnel complex near Su Chai. His orders were to slow down American exploration of the tunnels by any means necessary, to give time for other soldiers to remove valuable supplies and documents from the complex before it was overrun. He positioned himself at a turn in the tunnel, where the passage bent sharply to the left. This position gave him a tactical advantage because anyone coming around the turn would be temporarily off balance and unable to see him until they were completely around the corner. He waited in total silence for over an hour, knowing Americans were in the tunnel system, but not knowing when one might reach his position. When he finally heard sounds of someone approaching, crawling through the tunnel toward his position, he aimed his pistol at where he knew the person would appear when they came around the turn. His heart was pounding. His hands were shaking. He knew he might die in the next few seconds, but he held his position and waited. The American tunnel rat came around the corner. The Vietnamese defender saw the beam of a flashlight first, then a hand holding a pistol, then a face. He fired 3 times. The American was hit and fell backward around the corner. The defender heard sounds of the American crawling away, wounded, retreating back through the tunnel. The defender immediately fled his position, knowing that more Americans would come soon, and he had completed his mission of slowing their advance. This Vietnamese soldier survived the war, and later said that moment in the tunnel had stayed with him forever. Shooting another human being at such close range, seeing the impact of the bullets, knowing he had caused that person terrible pain and possibly death. Like the American tunnel rats, he carried psychological scars from the intimate violence of tunnel combat. Some tunnel encounters were influenced by pure chance or accident. Corporal James Mullins was crawling through a tunnel when his flashlight caught a tripwire stretched across the passage. He stopped immediately and carefully examined the wire, tracing it back to a grenade in an alcove. He successfully disarmed the trap, then continued forward. About 30 feet beyond where the trap had been, the tunnel turned sharply right. Mullins approached the turn cautiously, using his flashlight to check for more traps. As he came around the corner, his light fell on a Viet Cong soldier who was in the process of setting up another booby trap. Both men were surprised. The Vietnamese soldier dropped the grenade he had been handling and reached for his rifle. Mullins fired instinctively. The wounded Vietnamese soldier fell back, but in falling, he knocked over an oil lamp that had been providing light for his trap-setting work. The lamp broke, spilling burning oil across the tunnel floor. Now, Mullins was faced with a new problem: fire in the tunnel. The burning oil was creating smoke that was rapidly filling the narrow passage, and fire was beginning to spread to some wooden supports that had been installed in this section of the tunnel. Mullins had to retreat immediately before the smoke overcame him, or the fire spread to block his escape route. He crawled backward as fast as he could, choking on smoke, his eyes watering, navigating more by feel than sight because the smoke was obscuring his flashlight beam. He made it back to the entrance, coughing and gasping, his face and hands covered in soot. The tunnel complex was left with a fire burning deep inside it. Eventually, the fire burned itself out, but it had destroyed that section of the tunnel and possibly caused collapses in connected passages. It was a bizarre and unexpected outcome to what had started as a routine tunnel exploration mission. These stories illustrate the chaotic, unpredictable nature of tunnel combat. Every mission was different. Every encounter played out in unique ways based on the specific circumstances, the layout of the particular tunnel, the training and experience of the individuals involved, and simple luck. There was no standard operating procedure for fighting in the tunnels because every situation was unique and required improvisation. What all these combat experiences shared was the intense psychological impact on the men involved. Killing or being shot at in the confined darkness of a tunnel, where you could see and hear everything in horrifying detail, left lasting mental scars. Many tunnel rats experienced nightmares for years or decades after their service. They would wake up sweating, having dreamed they were back in the tunnels, trapped in the dark, fighting for their lives. Some developed full-blown post-traumatic stress disorder. They experienced flashbacks where they would suddenly feel like they were back in the tunnels, even decades later. Loud noises, confined. Spaces, darkness, any of these could trigger intense anxiety or panic attacks. Some former tunnel rats found they couldn't work in buildings without windows, or couldn't ride in elevators without experiencing severe claustrophobia, even though they had never been claustrophobic before their tunnel experiences. The psychological casualties of tunnel warfare were as real as the physical casualties, though they received far less attention and treatment. The military of the 1960s and 70s had limited understanding of psychological trauma, and even less capacity to treat it effectively. Soldiers were expected to be tough, to handle their problems without complaining. Mental health issues were stigmatized, so tunnel rats often suffered in silence, dealing with their psychological injuries privately for years or decades until the trauma could no longer be contained. But in the moment, in the tunnels, there was no time to think about future psychological consequences. There was only the mission, the darkness, the fear, and the absolute necessity of keeping your wits about you, because any moment of inattention could be fatal. The tunnel rats pushed their fears aside, controlled their panic, and did what had to be done. The The psychological price they paid for that service would only become fully apparent years later, long after they had returned home from the war. The human body was never designed to spend prolonged periods crawling through underground tunnels. The physical demands of tunnel rat duty were extreme, and the accumulated physical damage affected men for the rest of their lives. But it was the psychological toll that proved most devastating, creating wounds that were invisible but permanent, affecting tunnel rat veterans decades after their service ended. The physical act of crawling through tunnels for hours at a time destroyed the body systematically. The constant pressure on knees and elbows, sliding across rough surfaces, created chronic joint damage. The hard clay floors of the tunnels, embedded with small rocks and root fragments, acted like sandpaper against skin and tissue. Tunnel rats would emerge from missions with their knees and elbows raw and bleeding, the skin scraped away down to exposed tissue in some cases. This wasn't just a matter of minor abrasions. The repeated trauma to joints over weeks and months of tunnel duty caused permanent damage. Cartilage wore away. Scar tissue built up. Years later, former tunnel rats would suffer from severe arthritis and chronic joint pain. Many required knee or elbow replacements in middle age, their joints having deteriorated far beyond what would be expected for their age due to the extreme wear from tunnel crawling. The hands suffered particularly severe damage. Tunnel rats used their hands constantly for support and navigation, feeling their way through the darkness, pulling themselves forward through narrow passages. Fingertips became calloused, and then sometimes damaged beyond that, with nails broken or torn off by catches on rocks or roots. Some rats suffered nerve damage in their hands from the constant pressure and strain, developing chronic pain and numbness that persisted for decades. The back and spine took tremendous punishment as well. Crawling on your stomach for hours forces the spine into an unnatural curve. The constant scraping of your back against the tunnel ceiling created abrasions and bruising. But worse was the structural damage from the awkward postures required by tunnel movement. Many tunnel rats developed chronic back problems, herniated discs, and spinal issues that plagued them for life. The respiratory system suffered from the tunnel environment. The air in the tunnels was laden with dust particles, mold spores, and other contaminants. Every breath pulled this material into the lungs. The constant inhalation of clay dust was particularly harmful, causing a form of silicosis similar to what miners experience. Former tunnel rats often developed chronic respiratory problems, including asthma, chronic bronchitis, and reduced lung capacity. Some developed more serious lung diseases decades later that doctors attributed to their tunnel exposure. The damp, moldy conditions in the tunnels fostered various infections. Fungal infections of the skin, particularly on the hands, feet, and groin, were endemic among tunnel rats. These infections were difficult to treat in field conditions and often became chronic. Some rats developed systemic fungal infections that affected internal organs, requiring extensive medical treatment. Parasitic infections were also common. The soil in the tunnels often contained parasites from human and animal waste used by the Viet Cong for fertilizer and deliberately applied to booby traps. Tunnel rats crawling through contaminated soil would get microscopic cuts and abrasions that allowed parasites to enter their bodies. Intestinal parasites, skin parasites, and other organisms infected many rats, causing illness that sometimes wasn't diagnosed until months after exposure. The constant exposure to the Viet Cong's biological warfare tactics had long-term health consequences. The feces smeared on punji steaks contained not just bacteria, but potentially hepatitis, parasitic worms, and other pathogens. Rats who were injured by contaminated steaks often developed serious infections that required extended hospitalization, and sometimes resulted in permanent health problems. Hearing damage was nearly universal among tunnel rats. The acoustic environment of the tunnels amplified sound in ways that were extremely damaging to hearing. When a firearm was discharged in a tunnel, the sound pressure level was intense enough to cause immediate hearing damage. The confined space prevented sound waves from dispersing, concentrating all the acoustic energy in the narrow passage. Tunnel rats who were involved in firefights underground almost always suffered some degree of hearing loss. Many rats emerged from the tunnels with their ears ringing, a condition called tinnitus that in some cases never went away. Decades later, former tunnel rats would still hear constant ringing or buzzing in their ears, a permanent reminder of their tunnel experiences. Some suffered more severe hearing loss, requiring hearing aids in their 30s or 40s. And some became essentially deaf in one or both ears from the acoustic trauma of tunnel combat. The eyes suffered as well, though in more subtle ways. The constant strain of trying to see in minimal light conditions, often just brief flashes from a flashlight, followed by complete darkness, was hard on vision. Some rats developed chronic eye strain and headaches. Others found their night vision was permanently affected, either degraded from the constant exposure to sudden bright muzzle flashes and otherwise total darkness, or oddly enhanced as their eyes adapted to function in minimal light conditions. But as severe as the physical toll was, the psychological damage proved even more debilitating for many tunnel rat veterans. The human mind, like the human body, was not designed for the conditions tunnel rats faced. The combination of extreme danger, claustrophobic confinement, sensory deprivation, and intense violence created psychological stress that exceeded what most people could handle without suffering lasting damage. The most common psychological issue was what would now be diagnosed as post-traumatic stress disorder, though in the Vietnam era, it was often dismissed as shell shock or combat fatigue, or not recognized as a legitimate medical condition at all. Tunnel rats experienced PTSD symptoms at rates that were extraordinarily high, even compared to other combat veterans. Nightmares were nearly universal. Former tunnel rats reported recurring dreams of being back in the tunnels, unable to move, unable to breathe, with something approaching them in the darkness. These nightmares often persisted for decades. Some veterans reported still having tunnel nightmares 40 or 50 years after their service, waking up in a cold sweat, their heart racing, feeling like they were back underground in Vietnam. Flashbacks were common as well. A former tunnel rat might be going about his normal life when something would trigger an intense, vivid flashback to his tunnel experiences. The trigger could be entering a dark room, hearing a sudden loud noise, feeling confined in an elevator or small space, or sometimes nothing obvious at all. Suddenly they would feel like they were back in the tunnels, experiencing the fear and danger as if it were happening in the present moment. Claustrophobia affected many former tunnel rats, ironically enough. Men who had been able to control their fear of confined spaces during their service often found that once they returned home, they could no longer tolerate enclosed environments. Elevators became impossible to use. Small rooms with closed doors triggered panic attacks. Some veterans found they had to sleep with windows open and doors unlocked because the feeling of being enclosed was intolerable. Hypervigilance, the state of being constantly alert for danger, became a permanent condition for many tunnel rat veterans. In the tunnels, hypervigilance was necessary for survival. You had to be constantly aware, constantly checking for threats, because any moment of inattention could be fatal. But when veterans came home, they often found they couldn't turn off that heightened state of alertness. They would be constantly scanning for threats, unable to relax, jumping at sudden sounds or movements. This constant state of high alert was exhausting and made normal life difficult. Depression was another common issue. The intense experiences of tunnel duty, the constant brush with death, the killing of other human beings at close range, the loss of fellow rats who were killed in the tunnels, all of this created a psychological burden that many men struggled to carry. Some developed severe depression, losing interest in activities they had once enjoyed, struggling with feelings of guilt or worthlessness, sometimes contemplating or attempting suicide. Survivor's guilt affected many tunnel rats who had lost friends and comrades to tunnel combat. They would ask themselves why they had survived when others hadn't. What made them special or different? Was it skill, luck, or some arbitrary fate? The random nature of survival in the tunnels, where one man might step on a booby trap, while another man just inches behind was unharmed, created a sense that survival was purely chance. This could lead to feelings that they didn't deserve to have survived, that they should have been the ones who died instead of their friends. Substance abuse became a coping mechanism for some tunnel rat veterans. Unable to deal with the psychological trauma, they turned to alcohol or drugs to numb the pain and fear. This self-medication provided temporary relief, but often led to addiction and further psychological and physical deterioration. Some tunnel rat veterans struggled with substance abuse for years or decades. their lives derailed by their inability to process their trauma in healthier ways. Relationship problems were common among tunnel rat veterans. The psychological changes they had undergone made it difficult to relate to people who hadn't shared their experiences. They often felt isolated and misunderstood. Spouses and family members couldn't comprehend what they had experienced and didn't know how to help. The veterans themselves often couldn't articulate what they were feeling or why they were having difficulties. This led to divorce, estrangement from family, and social isolation for many former tunnel rats. Some veterans experienced what psychologists call dissociation, a disconnect from reality or from their own emotions. They might feel like they were observing their own life from outside their body, or like their experiences weren't real. This dissociation was a defense mechanism their minds developed to cope with overwhelming trauma, but it made functioning in normal society difficult. Anger and irritability became chronic problems for some veterans. The constant stress of tunnel duty, the fear and violence they had experienced, sometimes left them with a hair-trigger temper. Minor frustrations would provoke intense, angry responses. Some veterans found themselves getting into fights or confrontations, unable to control their emotional reactions. This made employment difficult and strained personal relationships. The lack of recognition and understanding made the psychological burden even heavier. After returning home, tunnel rats found that few people knew or cared about what they had done. Unlike pilots or special forces, soldiers who received media attention and public recognition, tunnel rats were largely unknown. Their service and sacrifice went unacknowledged. When they tried to explain their experiences, they often encountered disbelief or incomprehension. How could anyone understand what it was like to crawl through enemy tunnels in pitch darkness? Most people couldn't even imagine it. This lack of recognition meant tunnel rat veterans felt isolated and unappreciated. They had done something extraordinarily difficult and dangerous, something that required tremendous courage. But no one seemed to know or care. This contributed to feelings of bitterness and resentment that added to the psychological burden they already carried. The military provided essentially no psychological support for tunnel rats during or after their service. There were no counseling services, no programs to help them process their trauma, no screening to identify veterans who were struggling psychologically. They were simply expected to tough it out, to handle their problems on their own like men were supposed to do. This lack of support meant many tunnel rat veterans suffered needlessly for years or decades with treatable psychological conditions. It wasn't until the 1980s and 90s when PTSD began to be recognized as a legitimate medical condition, and when Vietnam veterans began to receive better mental health services, that many tunnel rat veterans finally got help. But by then, decades of suffering had already passed. Some men's lives had been permanently derailed by their untreated psychological trauma. Marriages had failed, careers had been destroyed, and some veterans had died by suicide or from the effects of substance abuse before help became available. Former tunnel rat Jimmy Thornton later described his decades-long struggle with PTSD. For 20 years after returning from Vietnam, he suffered from severe nightmares, flashbacks, and anxiety, but never sought help because he didn't think anything could be done, and he was ashamed to admit he was struggling. He self-medicated with alcohol, which led to job loss and divorce. It wasn't until the mid-1980s, when a VA counselor reached out to him after he had a breakdown in public, that he finally started receiving treatment. The counselor's words stayed with him. What you experienced in those tunnels would break most people. The fact that you're still functioning at all shows incredible strength. But you don't have to carry this burden alone anymore. With treatment, Thornton's condition improved. He learned coping strategies for managing his PTSD symptoms. He connected with other tunnel rat veterans who understood his experiences. He found purpose in speaking at schools and veteran groups, educating people about tunnel rat history. His life didn't become perfect. The psychological scars never fully healed, but he found a way to live with them. His story was typical of many tunnel rat veterans. The trauma was real and permanent, but with proper support and treatment, it could be managed. The tragedy was that so many veterans suffered needlessly for so long because that support and treatment weren't available, or because they didn't know to seek it or felt they couldn't admit they needed help. The physical and psychological toll of tunnel rat duty raised serious questions about whether the mission was worth the cost. Was the intelligence gathered and the enemy casualties inflicted worth the permanent damage to the soldiers who went underground? Different people answered that question differently. Military commanders tended to argue yes, that the tunnel rat program provided valuable intelligence and helped neutralize an important enemy asset. The tunnel rats themselves had mixed feelings. Some felt their service had been valuable and necessary. Others felt they had been asked to do something impossibly dangerous for questionable benefit. What was undeniable was that the men who served as tunnel rats paid an enormous price for their service. Not just the ones who died in the tunnels, though their sacrifice was the ultimate price, but also the ones who survived and carried physical and psychological scars for the rest of their lives. They had been asked to do something extraordinary, and they had answered that call, but the cost had been far higher than anyone had anticipated or acknowledged at the time. The tunnel rats conducted operations continuously from 1966 through 1971, the period of peak American involvement in the Vietnam War. These operations varied in scale from small team efforts to explore a newly discovered tunnel entrance to major operations involving dozens of rats, supporting large-scale infantry sweeps through Viet Cong strongholds. Some operations were quick hit-and-run affairs, while others stretched over days or weeks as rats systematically explored and mapped extensive tunnel complexes. Operation Cedar Falls in January 1967 represented one of the largest applications of tunnel rat capabilities. This massive operation involved over 30,000 American and South Vietnamese troops sweeping through the Iron Triangle, the heavily contested area northwest of Saigon that included Cu Chi. The goal was to clear the region of Viet Cong forces, destroy their infrastructure, and forcibly relocate the civilian population to deny the enemy support. Tunnel rats played a central role in Cedar Falls. Infantry units discovered tunnel entrances throughout the operation area, and rats went down to explore each one. Over the course of the operation, tunnel rats explored dozens of tunnel complexes, some small and some vast. They mapped tunnels, recovered documents and intelligence materials, located weapons caches, and identified storage and living areas. The intelligence haul from Cedar Falls was significant. Tunnel rats brought up boxes of documents, maps showing other tunnel locations, and Viet Cong operational plans, rosters of enemy units, supply inventories, and propaganda materials. They discovered large weapons caches including rifles, machine guns, mortars, and thousands of rounds of ammunition. They found medical supplies, food stores, and equipment that revealed the scope of Viet Cong operations in the region. But the human cost was high. Multiple tunnel rats were killed during Cedar Falls. Some were shot by Viet Cong defenders. Some triggered booby traps. One rat was bitten by a bamboo viper and died before he could be evacuated to medical care. Many more were wounded but survived, and all of them experienced the psychological stress of descending into hostile tunnels day after day, never knowing if this mission would be their last. The operation appeared successful. The military reported destroying hundreds of tunnel entrances and thousands of feet of passages using explosives and Rome plow bulldozers that tore up the ground above the tunnels. Large quantities of enemy supplies were captured or destroyed. The Viet Cong appeared to have been driven from the Iron Triangle, but within months, intelligence revealed the Viet Cong had returned. They had waited out the American operation in deeper sections of the tunnels that hadn't been discovered, or they had evacuated temporarily to Cambodia and returned after American forces withdrew, and they immediately began rebuilding the damaged sections of their tunnel systems. By mid-1967, the Cu Chi tunnels were once again fully operational. This pattern repeated throughout the war. American forces would launch major operations, tunnel rats would explore and help destroy sections of the tunnel network, and the Viet Cong would rebuild after the Americans left. It became frustratingly clear that the tunnels could never be permanently eliminated without maintaining a constant American presence in the area, which would require far more troops than were available and would result in a static defensive strategy that went against American military doctrine. Despite this strategic frustration, individual tunnel rat operations continued to produce results. In February 1968, just before the Tet Offensive, tunnel rats discovered a major Viet Cong headquarters complex in the Cu Chi tunnels. The underground facility was extensive, containing meeting rooms, sleeping quarters for dozens of soldiers, a well-equipped medical aid station, and most importantly, a command room with maps and documents detailing the upcoming Tet offensive plans for the Saigon area. The team of tunnel rats that explored this complex worked for 3 days, carefully mapping the layout, cataloging what they found, and systematically removing intelligence materials. They brought up boxes and boxes of documents. The maps showed planned attack routes for Viet Cong units during the Tet offensive. Rosters listed unit strengths and commanders. Supply documents revealed logistical preparations for the offensive. This intelligence gave American commanders critical information about the scale and scope of the upcoming attacks. But the cost was high. Of the 12 tunnel rats who entered that complex over 3 days, 2 were killed by booby traps. 1 was bitten by a bamboo viper and nearly died from the venom before being evacuated to a hospital, and 3 others sustained injuries ranging from falls through false floors to puncture wounds from punji stakes. A 50% casualty rate for the mission. Yet commanders considered it a success because of the valuable intelligence recovered. This brutal calculation, trading American casualties for intelligence and enemy losses, defined much of the tunnel rat experience. The missions were necessary from a military perspective. The intelligence recovered saved American lives by revealing enemy plans and capabilities. The weapons and supplies destroyed couldn't be used against American forces. The Viet Cong casualties inflicted in tunnel combat reduced enemy strength. But achieving these results required sending men into situations where casualties were not just possible, but likely. Australian forces serving in Vietnam also developed their own tunnel rat units. The 1st Australian Task Force, operating in Puak Tuai Province, encountered extensive tunnel systems in their operational area. Australian tunnel rats operated independently from American rats, but faced the same challenges and dangers. They developed similar techniques and suffered similar casualties. The Australians brought some different perspectives to tunnel warfare based on their military culture and training. They emphasized small unit tactics and individual initiative, which worked well in the independent environment of tunnel exploration. Australian rats were known for being particularly methodical and careful in their approach, taking time to thoroughly check for booby traps and map tunnel layouts accurately. This careful approach may have resulted in slightly lower casualty rates, though reliable statistics are difficult to obtain. One notable Australian tunnel rat was Corporal Bob Bowtell, who conducted numerous tunnel operations in Puak Tuai. He developed a reputation for being able to sense booby traps, what some called a sixth sense, but was really just exceptional attention to detail and experience recognizing the subtle signs of trap placement. Bowtell survived his tour of duty despite going down into hostile tunnels over 100 times, and after the war, he became an advocate for tunnel rat veterans, helping to ensure their service was recognized and their needs were addressed. The South Vietnamese military also had soldiers who worked in the tunnels, though they were less formally organized than American or Australian tunnel rat units. South Vietnamese soldiers had some advantages in tunnel work, particularly their typically smaller size made it easier to navigate the narrow passages. They also had better language skills for interrogating captured Viet Cong and understanding documents found in the tunnels. But they often lacked the equipment and support that American rats had access to, and their casualty rates appear to have been very high, though again, reliable statistics are scarce. As the war progressed and American involvement began to wind down in the early 1970s, tunnel rat operations became less frequent. The policy of Vietnamization, transferring responsibility for combat operations to South Vietnamese forces, meant fewer American soldiers were conducting tunnel missions. Some tunnel rat expertise was transferred to South Vietnamese units, but the complex skills required for successful tunnel operations were difficult to teach quickly. By 1972, most American ground combat forces had withdrawn from Vietnam, and tunnel rat operations by American soldiers had essentially ceased. When South Vietnam fell to North Vietnamese forces in 1975, the tunnel systems that had played such an important role in the war were left intact. The Vietnamese government eventually turned some sections into tourist attractions and war memorials, but most of the vast underground network was simply abandoned, the tunnels gradually deteriorating or collapsing over the decades. The legacy of the tunnel rats is complex and multifaceted. From a purely military perspective, their operations provided valuable intelligence and helped deny the Viet Cong the unrestricted use of their tunnel systems. The documents recovered, weapons destroyed, and enemy soldiers killed or captured by tunnel rats contributed to the American war effort. But whether this contribution justified the costs, both human and material, is debatable. From a historical perspective, the tunnel rats represent an unusual chapter in military history. Tunnel warfare itself is not unique. Soldiers have fought in tunnels and underground fortifications throughout history. But the specific nature of the Cu Chi tunnels, the asymmetric warfare environment of Vietnam, and the improvised nature of American tunnel rat operations created a unique situation that has few, if any, parallels in military history. The tunnel rats demonstrated remarkable courage and adaptability. They were mostly young men, many still teenagers, who volunteered for extraordinarily dangerous duty and performed it effectively despite minimal training and equipment. They developed techniques and tactics on the fly, learned from their mistakes, and persevered through psychological stress that would have broken most people. Whatever else can be said about the Vietnam War, the courage of the tunnel rats is undeniable, but their story also highlights some of the failures and limitations of American military strategy in Vietnam. The tunnel systems represented a problem that American military could not solve. Superior firepower, air superiority, and technological advantages meant little when fighting an enemy underground. The tunnel rats were an attempt to address this problem, but ultimately, they could only mitigate it, not solve it. The Viet Cong retained the use of their tunnel systems throughout the war, despite American efforts to destroy them. The tunnel rat experience also reveals the human cost of war in ways that statistics about casualties and combat operations often obscure. These were real people, with families and futures, who were forever changed by what they experienced underground. Some made successful transitions back to civilian life despite their trauma. Others struggled for decades or for the rest of their lives. All of them paid a price for their service that extended far beyond their months or years in Vietnam. In the decades after the war, tunnel rats began to receive some of the recognition they deserved. Veterans groups formed, connecting former rats and providing mutual support. Books and documentaries told their stories to wider audiences. In 2007, a memorial was dedicated at Fort Moore, Georgia, honoring tunnel rats with a bronze statue and plaques describing their mission. For many tunnel rat veterans, this recognition came too late. Some had died before their service was acknowledged. Others had suffered for decades with untreated physical and psychological injuries. But for those who lived to see the memorials and read the books and received the recognition, there was at least some sense that their sacrifice had not been completely forgotten. The Vietnamese perspective on the tunnels and the tunnel rats is quite different. The Cu Chi tunnels are celebrated as symbols of Vietnamese resilience and ingenuity, demonstrations of how a determined people could resist a technologically superior enemy. The tunnel systems are sources of national pride, and sections preserved as tourist sites attract hundreds of thousands of visitors each year. The Viet Cong soldiers who built, lived in, and defended the tunnels are remembered as heroes who endured incredible hardships for their cause. The Vietnamese rarely mention American tunnel rats, specifically in their historical narratives. When they do, it's usually in the context of discussing American tactics and how Vietnamese forces defeated them. There's little acknowledgement of the courage it took for American soldiers to enter the tunnels, perhaps because such acknowledgement might complicate the narrative of Vietnamese resistance against foreign invaders. But some Vietnamese veterans, particularly those who themselves fought in the tunnels, have expressed a grudging respect for the American tunnel rats, recognizing the courage required to do what they did. The tunnel rats themselves, when asked decades later about their experiences, express mixed feelings. Many say they were proud of their service and believed what they did was important. They felt they were doing their duty, supporting their fellow soldiers, and trying to accomplish a difficult mission as best they could. But many also express anger or bitterness about how they were treated during and after the war, about the lack of recognition and support, about the physical and psychological damage they suffered with little acknowledgement or care from the military or government. Some tunnel rat veterans became advocates for better treatment of all combat veterans, using their own experiences to highlight the need for improved mental health services, better disability support, and greater recognition of the psychological costs of combat. They argued that their experiences, while extreme, were just more visible examples of the kind of trauma many combat veterans face. If society would acknowledge and address the needs of tunnel rats, perhaps it would do better at addressing the needs of all veterans. The tactical and technical lessons from tunnel rat operations have been studied by military organizations around the world. The importance of specialized training for underground combat, the psychological challenges of confined space warfare, the techniques for tunnel exploration and clearance, all of these have informed military doctrine. Modern military forces train for urban and underground combat with much more sophistication than was available to Vietnam-era tunnel rats, in part because of lessons learned from their experiences. But perhaps the most important legacy of the tunnel rats is simply their story. It's a story about ordinary people asked to do extraordinary things, about courage in the face of overwhelming fear, about perseverance despite impossible conditions, about the human capacity to adapt and endure, and about the costs, both visible and hidden, that soldiers pay when they serve in combat. The tunnel rats faced the darkness, both literal and metaphorical, and they didn't break. Some were wounded, some were killed, all were changed, but they kept going down into those black holes in the ground, mission after mission, because they believed it needed to be done, and they were willing to be the ones who did it. That commitment, that willingness to face fear and danger repeatedly for the sake of mission and comrades represents something fundamental about human courage and sacrifice. Their story deserves to be remembered, not just as a historical footnote to the Vietnam War, but as a testament to what humans can endure and accomplish when asked to serve. The tunnel rats of Cu Chi earned their place in history through their courage, their sacrifice, and their determination. They crawled through hell so others wouldn't have to, and they deserve to be remembered for it. More than 50 years have passed since the last American tunnel rats descended into the Cu Chi tunnels. Most of the men who served as tunnel rats are now in their 70s or 80s, or have already passed away. But for those who survive, the memories remain vivid. Time has not dimmed the intensity of those experiences or healed all the psychological wounds. The tunnel rats carry their service with them always, for better and worse. Many tunnel rat veterans describe a peculiar phenomenon. While specific details of their normal lives from the 1960s and 70s have faded with time, their memories of being in the tunnels remain crystal clear. They can remember the feel of the clay walls under their hands, the smell of the damp earth, the sound of their own breathing echoing in the confined space. They remember the faces of the men they served with, even if they can't remember the names of neighbors from 10 years ago. The intensity of the tunnel experience burned these memories into their minds in ways that normal experiences don't. For some veterans, these vivid memories are a burden. They would prefer to forget, to not have such clear recollections of moments of terror and violence. But the memories persist, unwanted but unavoidable. Trigger events can still bring everything rushing back. A dark basement, a loud noise, even a movie scene depicting confined spaces can suddenly transport a veteran back to the tunnels, can make him feel, even momentarily, like he's there again. For others, the memories have taken on a different quality with time. The fear has faded somewhat, replaced by a sense of pride and even nostalgia. Not nostalgia for the danger or the trauma, but for the intensity of the experience, for the clarity of purpose, for the bonds with fellow rats. Some veterans say that nothing in their civilian lives ever matched the significance of what they did in the tunnels. Everything else felt somehow less important, less real. This is a common experience among combat veterans in general, but particularly acute among tunnel rats because their experience was so unique and so extreme. How do you explain to someone who has never been in combat what it's like? And how do you explain to someone who was in combat but on the surface what it was like to fight underground in pitch darkness? The isolation of the tunnel rat experience has meant that many veterans have never been able to fully share or process what they went through. The tunnel rat reunions that began in the 1990s provided some opportunity for veterans to connect with others who truly understood. These gatherings, whether small informal meetings or larger organized events, gave tunnel rats a chance to share stories, to compare experiences, to support each other. For many, meeting other tunnel rats decades after the war was therapeutic. They could finally talk openly about their experiences with people who got it, who didn't need explanations or context, who had been there in their own way. At these reunions, stories are told and retold. War stories, yes, but also stories about the men they served with, about moments of dark humor and terrible circumstances, about near misses and unlikely survivals. There's laughter along with the pain, camaraderie along with the trauma. These gatherings have helped many tunnel rat veterans feel less alone, less isolated by their unique experiences. The reunions have also served to preserve the history of tunnel rat operations. As veterans have aged and passed away, there's been an urgency to record their stories before they're lost. Various veterans and historians have conducted interviews, recorded oral histories, and written books documenting the tunnel rat experience. This preservation work ensures that future generations will know about this unique chapter of military history. One such project was initiated by Captain Robert Berman, himself a former tunnel rat, who spent years tracking down and interviewing tunnel rat veterans from multiple units. His archive contains hundreds of hours of recorded interviews, along with photographs, documents, and other materials donated by veterans. This collection has become an invaluable resource for researchers and has helped ensure that the tunnel rat story will be preserved. The families of tunnel rats have their own complex relationship with this history. Many tunnel rats never spoke to their families about their experiences. They came home from the war, tried to put it behind them, and never discussed what they had done in Vietnam. Their wives and children knew they had served, knew they had experienced combat, but didn't know the specifics. These families often struggled to understand the changes in their husbands or fathers, the anger or depression or nightmares, without knowing the context. In some cases, it was only decades later, when tunnel rats began opening up at reunions or when historians interviewed them, that family members learned what their loved ones had actually done in the war. These revelations were sometimes shocking. Learning that your father had crawled through enemy tunnels in pitch darkness, had killed people at point-blank range, had survived traps and combat that should have killed him, puts his behavior and struggles in a new light. Some families reported that learning this history helped them understand their veteran family member better. It explained behaviors and struggles. That had seemed inexplicable before. It gave context to the nightmares, the claustrophobia, the difficulty adjusting to civilian life. But it also created new concerns and grief, as families realized just how much their loved ones had suffered and endured, often in silence for decades. The children of tunnel rats have formed their own support networks in recent years, connecting through social media and veteran organizations. They share stories about growing up with fathers who were tunnel rat veterans, about the challenges of understanding their father's struggles, and about trying to honor their father's service. Some have become advocates for veteran mental health services, motivated by watching their fathers struggle with untreated PTSD for years. The question of whether the tunnel rat mission was worth the cost remains contentious. Military historians debate whether the intelligence gathered and enemy casualties inflicted justified the American losses and the physical and psychological damage to the tunnel rats themselves. Some argue that tunnel rat operations provided crucial intelligence that saved American lives and disrupted Viet Cong operations. They point to specific instances where documents recovered from tunnels revealed enemy plans, allowing American forces to prevent attacks or ambush enemy units. Others argue that the tunnel rat program was a tactical response to a strategic problem that couldn't be solved tactically. The Viet Cong tunnel systems were ultimately a symptom of the larger strategic challenge facing American forces in Vietnam, fighting a guerrilla enemy that could blend into the population, strike unexpectedly, and then disappear. Destroying sections of tunnel systems didn't address this fundamental strategic problem. The Viet Cong simply rebuilt what was destroyed and continued their operations. From the perspective of the tunnel rats themselves, opinions vary. Some veterans believe strongly that their service was valuable and necessary. They point to the intelligence they recovered, the weapons caches they destroyed, the enemy soldiers they killed or captured. They believe they did important work that helped their fellow soldiers and advanced the American mission in Vietnam, whatever one's opinion of that mission might be. Others are more ambivalent or even bitter. They feel they were asked to do something extraordinarily dangerous with inadequate training, equipment, and support. They suffered physical and psychological damage that affected them for decades, and they received little recognition or compensation for it. Some feel their sacrifice was wasted because the larger war effort failed and South Vietnam ultimately fell to communist forces. What was the point of all that danger and trauma, they ask, if the outcome was defeat anyway? Most tunnel rat veterans fall somewhere between these poles. They're proud of their individual service and courage, proud of what they accomplished and how they supported their fellow soldiers. But they're also aware of the larger strategic failures of the Vietnam War, and uncertain about whether their specific contributions made a meaningful difference in the final outcome. This ambivalence is common among Vietnam veterans generally, but it's particularly acute among tunnel rats because their mission was so difficult and their sacrifice was so great. The medical and scientific communities have taken some interest in tunnel rat veterans as a unique population for studying the long-term effects of extreme stress and trauma. Research projects have examined the physical and psychological health outcomes of tunnel rat veterans decades after their service, comparing them to other combat veterans and to non-combat populations. These studies have documented the high rates of PTSD, depression, anxiety disorders, and substance abuse among tunnel rat veterans, as well as the physical health problems related to their service. Some of this research has contributed to broader understanding of combat trauma and has informed the development of better treatment approaches. The lessons learned from studying tunnel rat veterans have been applied to help veterans from more recent conflicts, particularly those who served in urban combat environments or who experienced intense, sustained psychological stress. In this sense, the suffering of tunnel rats has at least contributed to helping other veterans receive better care. The Vietnamese government's preservation of sections of the Cu Chi tunnels as tourist sites has created a strange sort of commemorative space. These sanitized, widened, well-lit tunnel sections bear little resemblance to the actual combat tunnels, but they give visitors some sense of the underground environment. The interpretation at these sites focuses almost entirely on Vietnamese perspectives, the ingenuity of the tunnel builders, the hardships endured by Viet Cong soldiers living underground, the ultimate victory over American forces. American tunnel rats are rarely mentioned in the Vietnamese interpretation of these sites. When they are referenced, it's usually briefly and in the context of American tactics that failed to eliminate the tunnels. There's no acknowledgement of the courage it took for American soldiers to enter these tunnels, no recognition of the losses they suffered. This is understandable from a Vietnamese nationalist perspective. These are memorials to Vietnamese victory, not American valor. But for American tunnel rat veterans who have visited these sites, the lack of acknowledgement can be painful. A few tunnel rat veterans have traveled back to Vietnam decades after the war, visiting the tunnel sites and the areas where they served. These journeys have been emotionally complex. Some veterans found a sense of closure, seeing the tunnels in peacetime, empty and safe, and reflecting on having survived an experience that could easily have killed them. Others found the experience re-traumatizing, triggering memories and emotions they thought they had processed years ago. Some veterans have met with former Viet Cong soldiers who defended the tunnels in organized reconciliation programs or by chance encounters. These meetings between former enemies have sometimes been surprisingly positive. Despite the language barrier and the historical enmity, there's often a mutual recognition of shared experience. Both sides understand what it was like to fight in those tunnels, to face death in that darkness. That shared understanding can transcend the political and ideological divisions that led to the war. One such encounter involved former tunnel rat Sergeant James Mullins and a former Viet Cong tunnel defender named Nguyen Van Than. They met in the 1990s at a reconciliation event in Ho Chi Minh City. Through translators, they discovered they had both fought in the same tunnel complex near Cu Chi in 1967, possibly on the same day, though they couldn't be certain they had directly encountered each other. They spent several hours talking about their experiences, about the fear and the difficulty of tunnel combat, about what happened to them after the war. Mullins later said that meeting Than changed how he thought about his service and the war. He had spent decades thinking of the Vietnamese soldiers he had fought as faceless enemies, almost abstract threats rather than real people. Meeting Than, learning about his life and his family and his own struggles after the war, made him realize that the Vietnamese soldiers were human beings just like him, fighting for their own reasons just as he had fought for his. This realization didn't change Mullins' opinion about whether the war was right or wrong, but it gave him a more complex and nuanced understanding of what he had been part of. The memorialization of tunnel rats in American military history has been a slow and incomplete process. Unlike other specialized units from Vietnam, like the Green Berets or the Navy SEALs, tunnel rats never achieved widespread public recognition. There were no major Hollywood movies about tunnel rats during or immediately after the war. News coverage during the war mentioned them only occasionally. The lack of official status, combined with the relatively small number of men who served as tunnel rats compared to regular infantry, meant they remained in the shadows of military history for decades. The 2007 memorial at Fort Moore was a significant step toward recognition, but many tunnel rat veterans feel more should be done. There have been proposals for additional memorials, for including tunnel rat history in military training curricula, and for ensuring that the tunnel rat story is preserved and taught as part of Vietnam War history. Some progress has been made, but advocates feel there's still work to be done to ensure that tunnel rats receive the recognition their service deserves. Educational. Efforts have been important in preserving and sharing tunnel rat history. Some tunnel rat veterans have spoken at schools, military academies, and veteran organizations, sharing their experiences with younger generations. These presentations serve multiple purposes. They educate people about this unique aspect of military history. They honor the service and sacrifice of tunnel rats. And they provide opportunities for veterans to process and share their experiences in a supportive environment. The physical artifacts of tunnel rat operations are rare. A few pieces of equipment were unique to tunnel rats. They mostly use standard military-issue pistols and flashlights. Some personal items have been preserved. Photographs of tunnel rats preparing for missions, letters home describing their experiences, journals kept during the war. These artifacts have found their way into military museums and private collections, physical evidence of what these men did and endured. One particularly poignant artifact is a tunnel rat's .45 caliber pistol, donated to a museum by the widow of a deceased tunnel rat veteran. The pistol shows wear from extensive use. The grips worn smooth from handling, scratches and dents on the metal. A small card with the pistol explains that it accompanied its owner down into hostile tunnels over 60 times during his tour in Vietnam. It was with him during multiple combat encounters. It saved his life at least twice in close-quarters firefights underground. After the war, the veteran kept the pistol as a reminder of his service, and before his death, he asked his wife to donate it to a museum so others could learn from it. Objects like this connect current generations to the tunnel rat experience in tangible ways that written accounts alone cannot. The physiological research on tunnel rats has revealed interesting findings about how humans adapt to extreme stress. Studies have shown that tunnel rat veterans often have permanent changes in their stress response systems. Their cortisol levels, heart rate variability, and other physiological markers of stress response are different from non-combat populations and even from other combat veterans. This suggests that the extreme sustained stress of tunnel duty cause permanent alterations in how their bodies handle stress. These findings have implications beyond just tunnel rat veterans. They suggest that certain types of extreme stress, particularly sustained stress, in environments where the person has little control and constant threat of death, can cause lasting physiological changes. This research has informed understanding of PTSD and trauma more broadly, contributing to the development of better screening tools and treatment approaches for all trauma survivors. The legal recognition of tunnel rat service for disability compensation purposes was a long struggle. For years, veterans seeking disability benefits for conditions related to tunnel duty faced skepticism from Veterans Affairs evaluators who didn't understand the unique nature of tunnel rat operations. Claims for hearing loss, joint damage, respiratory problems, and PTSD were often denied or minimized because evaluators didn't appreciate the extreme conditions tunnel rats had worked in. Advocacy by tunnel rat veterans and their representatives gradually improved this situation. Documentation of tunnel rat operations, testimony from commanders and medical personnel, and medical research on the specific health effects of tunnel duty helped establish that tunnel rats faced unique hazards that caused specific types of injuries. By the 2000s, VA evaluators were better informed about tunnel rat service, and claims were being adjudicated more fairly. But the decades of struggle to get appropriate recognition and compensation left many tunnel rat veterans feeling that their government had failed them after asking them to risk everything. The question of what motivated men to volunteer for tunnel rat duty continues to interest psychologists and military historians. What makes someone willing to do something so obviously dangerous? Research and interviews with tunnel rat veterans have revealed a complex mix of motivations. Some men volunteered for adventure, seeing tunnel duty as exciting or challenging in a way that regular infantry work wasn't. Some sought recognition or advancement, knowing that tunnel rat duty would get them noticed by commanders. Some volunteered out of a sense of duty, feeling that if someone had to do this dangerous work, they were willing to be that person. Many tunnel rats say they didn't fully understand what they were volunteering for. They knew tunnel duty was dangerous, but they couldn't really comprehend just how difficult and terrifying it would be until they experienced it themselves. By the time they truly understood what they had gotten into, they felt obligated to continue. They didn't want to let down their fellow rats or be seen as quitting, so they kept going back down, mission after mission. Even as their fear and stress accumulated, the role of leadership in tunnel rat operations was crucial. Good leaders could make an enormous difference in tunnel rat effectiveness and survival. Commanders who understood tunnel operations, who didn't push rats to take unnecessary risks, who ensured rats had the best available equipment and support, who recognized and addressed psychological stress, had units with better outcomes. Poor leaders who didn't understand tunnel operations, who treated rats as expendable, who failed to provide adequate support, had higher casualty rates and lower effectiveness. Captain Herb Thornton, who commanded tunnel rat operations in Sioux Chi, was remembered by his rats as an exceptional leader. He never ordered anyone to go down into a tunnel. He asked for volunteers and respected anyone who declined. He went down into tunnels himself regularly, never asking his men to do anything he wouldn't do. He advocated for his rats with higher command, fighting for better equipment and recognition. He noticed when rats were showing signs of excessive stress and would pull them from tunnel duty temporarily to recover. His leadership style was credited with saving lives and maintaining morale under extraordinarily difficult conditions. The long-term healthcare costs associated with tunnel rat service have been substantial. Many tunnel rat veterans require ongoing medical care for conditions related to their service: joint replacements, respiratory treatments, hearing aids, psychological counseling. The Veterans Health Administration has spent millions of dollars over the decades providing this care. From a purely economic perspective, the long-term costs of caring for tunnel rat veterans far exceeded the immediate costs of their operations during the war. This reality highlights a broader truth about the costs of war that's often overlooked in initial calculations. When governments decide to go to war, they calculate the immediate costs: equipment, personnel, operations. But the long-term costs of caring for veterans who were damaged physically and psychologically by their service often exceed these immediate costs. The tunnel rats represent an extreme example, but the principle applies to all combat veterans. The true cost of war includes the decades of care that society owes to those who served and were damaged by that service. The cultural impact of the tunnel rat story has been modest but growing. A few books have told their story to wider audiences. Documentary films have explored their experiences. Video games set in the Vietnam War have sometimes included tunnel sequences, though these typically fail to capture the true horror and difficulty of tunnel combat. The tunnel rats have appeared occasionally in fiction, usually as minor characters representing American courage and determination in Vietnam. One novel that featured tunnel rats prominently was The Tunnels of Q Chai by Tom Mangold and John Pennicate, published in 1985. While technically a work of non-fiction, the book's narrative structure and vivid descriptions of tunnel rat experiences brought their story to life for many readers. The book was widely read and helped raise awareness of tunnel rat operations. Many tunnel rat veterans credited the book with finally giving them some public recognition for their service. The ethical questions surrounding tunnel rat operations deserve consideration. Was it ethical to ask soldiers to do something so dangerous with such high casualty rates? Could commanders have done more to protect tunnel rats or refuse missions that were too risky? These questions don't have easy answers. Military operations always involve risk, and someone has to take that risk to accomplish the mission. But when the risk is extreme and the casualties are high, there's a legitimate question about whether the mission is worth the cost in human suffering. Some military ethicists have argued that tunnel rat operations represented an acceptable risk given the intelligence value and enemy casualties achieved. Others have argued that the high casualty rates and psychological damage made these operations ethically questionable, particularly given that they never achieved the strategic objective of eliminating the tunnel systems. The tunnel rats themselves have mixed opinions, with some believing their missions were justified and others feeling they were asked to do too much with too little support. The training improvements that came out of tunnel rat experiences have benefited subsequent generations of soldiers. Modern military forces train extensively for urban and underground combat, using lessons learned from tunnel rat operations. Soldiers learn about the psychological challenges of confined space combat, the importance of specialized equipment, the techniques for clearing underground facilities safely and effectively. While technology has advanced significantly since the Vietnam era, many fundamental principles remain the same, and tunnel rat veterans have sometimes been involved in developing modern training programs. The international military community has also studied tunnel rat operations. Military forces from numerous countries have examined how American and Australian forces dealt with the tunnel challenge in Vietnam, incorporating these lessons into their own doctrines for underground warfare. In conflicts where tunnel systems have played a role, such as in Gaza or in operations against ISIS, military planners have drawn on Vietnam-era experiences, including tunnel rat operations, to develop their tactics. The legacy of the tunnel rats extends beyond military history into questions about human psychology and resilience. What their story demonstrates is both the remarkable capacity of humans to adapt to extreme conditions and the limits of that adaptation. The tunnel rats showed that humans can function in situations that seem impossible to endure. Pitch darkness, claustrophobic confinement, constant mortal danger. They went down into the tunnels, mission after mission, and somehow maintained enough psychological stability to continue functioning. But their story also shows the costs of that adaptation. The physical damage, the PTSD, the depression, the relationship problems, all of these demonstrate that while humans can endure extreme conditions, they don't emerge unchanged or undamaged. The tunnel rats survived, but survival came at a price that many of them are still paying decades later. Understanding both the capacity for adaptation and its costs is important for anyone who might ask humans to endure extreme conditions, whether in military operations or in other contexts. The future preservation of tunnel rat history faces challenges. As the veteran population ages and passes away, the first-hand accounts are being lost. While oral history projects have preserved many stories, there are surely tunnel rats whose experiences were never recorded and will die with them. The physical evidence of tunnel rat operations is minimal and scattered. Without conscious efforts at preservation and education, there's a risk that tunnel rat history could be forgotten or reduced to footnotes in broader Vietnam War histories. Efforts to ensure tunnel rat history is preserved and taught continue. Veteran organizations maintain archives and conduct outreach. Museums include tunnel rat exhibits. Educational materials are being developed to teach about tunnel rat operations in schools and military training. These efforts ensure that future generations will know about the men who went down into the darkness and what they endured there. The story of the tunnel rats of Suu Kyi is ultimately a human story about courage, sacrifice, and the costs of war. It's about ordinary men who volunteered for extraordinary danger and somehow found within themselves the strength to endure. It's about the bonds formed between soldiers who face death together in circumstances that few others can understand. It's about the visible and invisible wounds that combat inflicts, and how those wounds persist long after the shooting stops. The tunnel rats face the ultimate test of courage, descending into hostile underground darkness, where every instinct screams at you to flee, where the enemy has every advantage, where death could come at any moment from traps or ambush or accident. They faced this test not once, but dozens or hundreds of times. Each descent required them to control their fear, trust their training and instincts, and force themselves into the tunnels despite knowing the terrible things that might wait below. They did this not because they were fearless. Every tunnel rat felt fear. They did it because they believed it needed to be done, because their fellow soldiers depended on the intelligence they could gather, because refusing felt like failure or betrayal, because they had volunteered and felt obligated to see it through. These very human motivations drove them to do something that seems superhuman in retrospect. The physical courage required to enter hostile tunnels is obvious and has been acknowledged, at least in some circles. But the psychological courage required deserves equal recognition. To function in absolute darkness, in spaces barely wide enough to fit your body, knowing that each movement might trigger a trap or alert an enemy, and to do this repeatedly over months, required a kind of psychological strength that most people don't possess or never have to discover in themselves. The tunnel rats of Cu Chi earned their place in history through their courage, determination, and sacrifice. They ventured into an underground hell to fight an enemy on his own ground, accepting terrible risks to accomplish their mission. Many died in those dark tunnels. Many more emerged physically or psychologically damaged in ways that affected them for the rest of their lives. All of them were forever changed by what they experienced. Their service reminds us that war demands extraordinary sacrifices from ordinary people. That courage is not the absence of fear, but the ability to function despite fear. That some missions are so difficult and dangerous that simply volunteering requires remarkable bravery. That the costs of war extend far beyond the battlefield and persist long after the conflict ends. The tunnel rats who survive today, now elderly men, carry within them memories and experiences that few living people share. They remember the weight of the earth above them, the feel of the clay walls, the absolute darkness, the terror, and the violence. They remember the friends who didn't come back up from the tunnels. They remember the physical and psychological pain. But they also remember the pride of accomplishment, the bonds with fellow rats, the knowledge that they did something extraordinarily difficult that most people couldn't do. As these veterans pass away one by one, their direct testimony will be lost. But their story will remain, preserved in the records and memorials and histories that document what they did. Future generations will read about the tunnel rats of Cu Chi and wonder at their courage, will try to imagine what it was like to descend into those dark passages, and will remember the debt owed to those who serve in war's most difficult and dangerous roles. The tunnels themselves still exist beneath the Vietnamese soil, though most sections have collapsed or been deliberately sealed. But the memory of what happened in those tunnels, the battles fought in absolute darkness between determined enemies, the courage and sacrifice of the men who went down into that black hell, these memories endure. The tunnel rats made sure, through their service and their sacrifice, that their part of the Vietnam War story would not be forgotten. They went into the darkness so others wouldn't have to. They faced fears that would break most people. They suffered in ways that affected them for decades, and they deserve to be remembered for it, not just as a historical footnote, but as exemplars of courage and sacrifice under the most extreme conditions imaginable. The tunnel rats of Cu Chi have earned their place among the honored warriors of military history, and their story deserves to be told and retold for as long as people remember the Vietnam War and honor those who fought in it.